Welcome to tonight's meeting of August 8th, 2023. We have some great presentations tonight I'm looking forward to, but first, let's have council reports. Councilor Rosati?
No.
Councilor Simon?
Last week, good evening, as many other people did too, with National Night Out. So a chance to talk with our neighbors from one end of town to the other. So that was excellent. On Thursday, and everybody can give their take on this, but Councilor Rosati, myself, Councilor Baker, and Councilor Nermella had lunch with Congresswoman Pedersen, and I thought it was a very good, frank discussion. We had an opportunity to get to know her a little bit better too, and we had some curious questions about how things are working in D.C. and personally too, how things were going. But Senator Faith Winter joined us as well, so I thought it was a very good conversation. We had frank discussion on some topics that are relative to our residents. So that was it for last week, except for spending an enjoyable Saturday with you all.
Councilor Evans?
Had National Night Out on Tuesday that I joined the mayor in, and went to about 7 different places across town, and well attended. And there are some that have been hosting for decades, and I mean that like 10 plus, 17, 25. So it was really great to see everybody out and about. Weather wasn't as great, but it was good enough for people to hang out and be with their neighbors and be with our PD staff and fire, and it was just an overall great night. So.
Is it bigger? Mayor Pro Tem?
A couple things. On Thursday, I had the Rocky Mountain Airport Roundtable. I shared with you guys about an hour ago some maps that have some proposed flight paths to the training grounds, which was kind of the task, is getting them there, as well as they talked about some tactics as far as how the planes climb and things of that nature in order to kind of help alleviate some of the noise. So that's kind of first go at it, getting some feedback from the group as far as what we thought about the flight paths. There was a handful of questions. It was remote this week, so but it's progress as far as I'm concerned. So we're actually having some proposed solutions, so we'll see where they go after they got the feedback from the group. The other thing I wanted to mention is this week is Inclusivity Board, and I can't make it, so I don't know if Councilor Zadi can. I believe is the alternate.
When is it?
It is at 6 on Wednesday. 6 to 7:30.
I'll let you know by email.
Okay. If not, maybe one of the rest of you can make it. If not, I can give them an update via email for the board or group chair to read. Aside from that, I was not able to go to National Night Out, but thank you to all the staff that worked on that with the community members to make that a success. I got good feedback. And then lastly, another thank you to the staff who joined us for the budget retreat this Saturday. It was a full day, and I appreciate their work and effort.
Councilor Nermella?
I too was unable to get to National Night Out. I think it was also National First Night of Soccer practice. So we had three different ones to try and get to at the same time. Yeah, Thursday was great with Senator, Representative Pedersen and Senator Winter. We were able to talk about a lot of different topics, including, we even got down to construction defects and potentially seeing some type of housing bill come back through the state again. So that was really helpful, and hopefully they'll continue to carry on our concerns. And yeah, the budget retreat was such a retreat. It was such a treat. No, actually, it was a lot of information that we had asked for, and if if folks listening haven't seen it, there's some really good info, particularly with the comparison between the other cities. And I know it's hard to do, but
And did you make it to Aurora
I did.
without
Yeah.
speeding?
Without speeding. There's no speeding to Aurora.
I went to the ribbon cutting this morning for Five Star Online Academy. What a great facility. It's in Westminster, and it is an online school, but they have a full staff of teachers, administration, to, if the kids need to do chemistry experiments, they can go to a place and do it as a mini class, alone with the teacher. However, this is going to be molded for whatever the kids need. So it goes second grade through 12th, and I've never seen so much energy in a room. They have 500 online students at this point, and I didn't ask if they have limits or anything, but it's third year, and they've been working at getting this facility going. So they have a wing that is for primary, and then a huge wing for secondary, and then the principals and the office space is sort of in the center. But great setup, great work that they've done, so kudos to them. National Night Out, my favorite night of the year. Yeah, we had people doing 25 or more years, same place, same neighborhood, and the way these people know each other. The officers, I saw Chief, your officers just relaxed, answering every question. We're there as buffers to remind them, but why is this happening? And I remind them, we have 1.75 of them to 1,000 of you. Therefore, that's 4 eyes almost to your 2,000 eyes. Therefore, we need you to be engaged and tell us what you see. And the officers were probing those kinds of things. What kind of activity do you see? Do you have any concerns? Just really down to earth, getting people to talk and share what they were concerned about. And I think this is the only way to do it. When you're in homes, we had 2 churches doing it with their congregations. People just had great questions. They interacted, the fire guys too, interacting with them. And the kids, you just see the kids' eyes, because this is a non-threatening, it's not an emergency situation, and everybody just having fun. So I think it serves such a great purpose in the community. And last year, I know we made 10. We didn't rush as much this year. We made 7. But the last one, the Dicks have done it for over 25 years. They have scrapbooks. She does a theme every year. And this year it was tacos. I've been there for the Pirates. I've been there for so many things. It is so fun. That neighborhood is so cohesive and knows each other because of National Night Out. One couple came up to us and said, oh, we moved here right after this last year, so they're telling us all about it. So this is our first experience, and they're so excited. And so when COVID hit, this neighborhood, being so connected, just couldn't let COVID go by without adding some more things. So they sort of have a 24-day advent with the mailboxes or whatever. Somebody sets up day 1 through 24 on the calendar for December. One of the main things is you have to decorate your mailbox, and the mailman picks who's the best mailbox. They give the prize, but the mailman picks. And so one day it might be garbage pickup day, so people are supposed to do something with their garbage cans. And we need every neighborhood to be like that. And each is so individual and so different, and have different concerns. I just love it, and I hope your officers got a lot out of it. And we encourage people, don't just sit there and burn over something. Call the non-emergency number and share, because then they'll know what to look for. So great event. I know it takes a lot of their time and energy, but thanks to them and to our firefighters.
You forgot the toilet paper contest.
Oh, that was, yeah,
They had
20 seconds, you had all this toilet paper there. And so in one hand, when they said go, you take a roll and you start stacking it, and whoever got the most, Lindsay won, she got a lottery ticket. And so, yeah, so
Hidden
she's always got the trivia going on. It's a great show. You've got to end up there some night because it's a good national night out. So, and the budget retreat was good. We got out early so you could get to Aurora, so everything's good.
Okay,
Your report.
all right. Good evening, Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, and councilors. Some city updates briefly. So first of all, the next Sheridan Green meeting will be held Thursday, August 24th, 6 to 7:30 p.m. at Sheridan Green Elementary School. In addition to emails, the web and social media updates, Sheridan Green community should expect to receive postcards inviting them to the meeting. For folks who want to learn more about this effort and this undertaking, you can go to our city website /Sheridan Green. And this will be an opportunity for the staff to take some of those ideas or visions, if you will, for how that property could be reused and roll them out to the community. And so we're looking forward to that conversation. Again, no decisions have been made at this point. We're continuing just to gather that feedback and get input from our community. Next thing on there, big celebration opportunity coming up on Wednesday, August 16th, 6 to 8 p.m. at Christopher Fields. But it's that complex will be turning 21, so 21 years that's been in place. And so come join and celebrate with us. Next slide.
Can I just ask a question? Is that going to be like just sort of an open house? Is there something that we want to be there at a certain time to see? Or is it just,
It's an open house
Come
forum.
as you go.
Come as you go,
Okay.
yes, ma'am. Westy Winds, great opportunity here with mowing with cops. So Officer Gonzalez runs this program for us and had 6 volunteers and 10 yards to mow in July. We had some Arvada officers who also partnered with us during the Teen Academy, and they were able to assist at a home site that is right on the border between Westminster and Arvada. And so, you know, just a great program that our department runs. And it's been a success. We look forward to turning it back on again next year. So looking forward to that. But thanks to WPD for working that. Next slide. Some things to know just happening in the next week here. So tomorrow evening, 6 to 7:30 p.m. here at the City Hall Multipurpose Room is a meet and greet with the Jeffco School Board. And so we encourage folks to attend that, come out and meet folks. Planning Commission meeting Tuesday, August 8th, 7 to 9 p.m. right here in Council Chambers. As mentioned, Inclusivity Board meeting goes Wednesday, August 9th, 6 to 7:30 p.m. in the CMO Conference Room. Friday night, Neighborhood Nights and Movies in the Park, 6:30 to 9:30 p.m. at Irving Street Library. Those have been very, very popular this year and well received by the community. And then our next meeting with the council, City Council meeting, Monday night, August 14th, 6:30 p.m., starting with the pre-meeting in here. And that's a pretty sizable agenda, a lot of moving pieces next Monday night. No information-only items this week. Next slide. And again, certainly the city staff, city team want to be accessible, responsive, transparent, and accountable. You can contact my office at 658-2006. You can email me directly at mfreitag@cityofwestminster.us. And you can follow us on X. You can like us on Facebook. You can check us out on Instagram. And you can ring our bell at Nextdoor. Pending any questions, that's all I have this evening.
and don't forget your green sheets.
All right. Mayor, can we move on
Let's
to our
get going.
presentations? Okay, so.
I'm excited about this next one.
For the mayor, mayor pro tem, and council, we have 3 agenda topics, a total of 4 presentations tonight. And so I'm going to introduce our next speaker tonight, accompanied by our police chief, but our district attorney. So glad to have Brian Mason join us this evening. Thank you very much. Look forward to a conversation about fentanyl and many other topics, I'm sure. And this is, again, a information presentation, but a great opportunity to get educated and be informed. Okay? Mr. District Attorney, please.
Thank you so much, Madam Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, councilors, Mr. City Manager. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Brian Mason. I am the District Attorney for Colorado's 17th Judicial District. Westminster, of course, is unique. You are in 2 judicial districts. Sometimes I wish you'd just pick a side, pick Adams County. But I'm your DA for the Adams County side of your city. And my hope tonight is to just give you a presentation on numerous things, but mostly fentanyl. Particularly because I believe everyone in public life needs to know what's going on with fentanyl. And I'm sure and confident that all of you have read newspaper articles about it and have followed this issue. And some of you may well have been touched by this issue through your own family lives or extended constituents, because certainly fentanyl has hit this community as it has hit the entire metro area very hard. And I can tell you I have been at the district attorney's office now, this is my 17th year. I've been the elected district attorney now for 3 years. And I didn't really know what fentanyl was for the first 14 years of my career. It just didn't have a big impact until about 2019, 2020, and then it exploded. And in my time since becoming the elected DA, it has overwhelmed law enforcement, it has overwhelmed DA's offices, it has overwhelmed our communities, and it is the most dangerous drug on the streets. And so I just want to tell you about it and talk to you a little bit about the things that I have learned and that we have learned over the last couple years so that you can be informed when your constituents ask you about it, and also tell you some of the things that we are doing and take your questions and your criticisms if you have them, because this is something that everyone has to be engaged in. I also, time permitting, put in a couple slides at the end on some other topics that I imagine you might want to ask me about. No question is off limits, but I've put something in there on motor vehicle theft and our juvenile assessment center issue. So there are some other public policy issues that I'd like to just take this opportunity to talk to you about, time permitting. I have given a similar presentation to other city councils here in the 17th Judicial District. And again, my goal is for us to engage in a conversation about it. So, and just briefly, I'm from Colorado. I grew up in Aurora, and I am a resident of the city of Westminster. So I'm very proud to be a Westminster citizen and resident, and I want to compliment the city manager and this council on your selection of Norm Haubert as chief. He's an outstanding chief of police, and I'm privileged to work with him. And I will say, I know these are on the record meetings, so I'm not allowed to have favorites, but I work with all of the police departments in this jurisdiction. Westminster's one of the best.
Sorry, we couldn't hear that. Say it a little louder.
It just is. So. All right. Let's go to the first slide if we can. So some facts about fentanyl. Fentanyl was developed as a pain relief drug. So I have actually had fentanyl, and that feels strange to say, but several years ago I had a medical issue here in Westminster and got picked up in an ambulance and taken to the hospital, and they gave me fentanyl in the ambulance, and let me tell you, it was amazing. It immediately, temporarily fixed the issue I was having, the pain I was having, and that was the original purpose for this drug. It's a synthetic opioid. What does that mean? That means this isn't something that is grown. It's not something like poppies that are watered in the fields of Afghanistan. This is something that's made in a lab. And when fentanyl is used for medical purposes and under the auspices of a medical professional, it's a very, very effective drug. Of course, as we all know, that's not the problem on the streets right now. So fentanyl is typically, by our research and knowledge, made in China and then shipped to Mexico or shipped to some other Central American countries where the drug cartels are most active. And they then take the fentanyl that they receive from China and mix it into other drugs. Now, when I first started talking about fentanyl, in my first 6 months as DA, What I told people, and this may even appear in a slide later, is that no drug is safe. And that remains true. No drug is safe because almost every drug that we see, not in every single case, but every drug out there has fentanyl. We have found fentanyl in it. So heroin, methamphetamine, cocaine, in limited circumstances, marijuana, and certainly oxys. So the oxy pills are the most common way that our users on the street are taking fentanyl. The scariest thing to me originally about fentanyl was the secretive nature of it being in drugs that people didn't know about. And we'll talk about that more. But as you will recall, my office had the largest case in the country for a short amount of time when 5 people in Commerce City died from fentanyl poisoning. And all 5 of them, the evidence was very clear about this. All 5 of them thought they were taking cocaine. So there was white powder lined up on glass mirrors. You don't snort fentanyl. And they were snorting a white powder that they clearly thought was cocaine. And they died almost instantaneously. And I was out there that night. I was on scene. I saw this apartment. It looked like a mass murder scene. And these were 5 individuals who clearly shouldn't have been taking cocaine, but also had no idea that they were about to take fentanyl and had no idea that they were playing Russian roulette with their lives. And there was a 2-month child in that apartment who lost both parents in one fell swoop. And that's how dangerous this drug is. I have met with far too many parents, and I imagine some of you have too, who have lost children to fentanyl poisoning. And I met with a father who had both of his sons, 24-year-old and 22-year-old sons, who were trying what they thought was an oxy pill for the first time. They weren't drug users, but they were both struggling with some things in their lives, and they were together, and they said, let's just try this pill, and they both never woke up. That's how dangerous this drug is. I will say that continues to frighten me, and it should frighten everybody, and there are very few public settings where I don't say something about fentanyl. But over the course of the last 2 years, more and more people have become addicted to fentanyl, and they know it. So we still have a problem with fentanyl being clandestinely added to drugs, but the cartels had a strategy, and their strategy in putting fentanyl into their other drugs in the first place was that fentanyl is a lot cheaper to make. It's just cheaper. And again, you don't have to grow it. You don't have to water it. You can just make it in a lab. And they mix it into these other drugs. And part of what makes fentanyl so dangerous is, particularly in these drugs that people are taking not realizing it, there's no oversight of drug cartels' production of their drugs, right? So we don't have government officials checking on how much they're putting in each thing. So one pill could have a fatal dose and another pill could not. So you can have 2 people take from the same batch and one person die from it and one person be just fine. And that's what's one of the things that's so dangerous. But part of the cartel's business strategy was to fold fentanyl into these other drugs clandestinely and then get their users to become addicted to fentanyl. So I can give you just an example. A typical, and this is my work, right? Not many people can spout about a typical heroin user, but I can, and so I will share it with you. A typical heroin user needs to get high 2 to 3 times a day to stay okay, basically, to keep their high on. A fentanyl user will have to take the fentanyl 7 to 8 times a day. So the drug cartels want people to get addicted to fentanyl because they're going to need more of it. And they're going to need more of it to feed their addiction. And so we have the fentanyl explosion over the last 2 to 3 years is in many parts because of this successful strategy of them getting people who never wanted to be addicted to fentanyl addicted anyway. And now many users are actively seeking out fentanyl. We still have a problem with people dying without realizing what they're taking, but it's really been overtaken by people who are just plain addicted to fentanyl itself. So, some of the statistics on this slide, it is literally the most addictive drug on the market. It is the most dangerous drug on the market. It's 50 times more potent than heroin and 100 times more potent than morphine. According to the DEA, 2 milligrams of fentanyl is usually a lethal dose. So why is that important for us to know? We're going to get to this in just a minute. But 4 grams of fentanyl can kill 2,000 people. And until about a year and a half ago, possessing 4 grams of fentanyl in this state was a misdemeanor. And that's something that we had to address, and we did. Let's go to the next slide, please. So why would drug dealers add fentanyl if it kills people? This is one of those moments in my time as the DA that will always stand out to me. I was meeting with some members of our drug task force, and I said to them, I just don't understand why they would be clandestinely putting fentanyl into their drugs and killing off their clients. It doesn't make good business sense to me that you would kill off people who are buying your product. And here was the answer, and I will never forget it. Users of fentanyl who are addicted to it essentially chase that first high for the rest of their lives. They never get it again. The very first high you get on fentanyl is the best one you will ever get. And so when you become addicted to it, you're always trying to get essentially a replication of that very first high that you had. And the cartels and drug dealers have built into their business model that some people are going to die. And the perverse effect and response to that from some users when someone dies from fentanyl overdose is, who was that dealer? He must have really good drugs. So having somebody die actually tells the other users that those drugs were really powerful and can be good for business. This is staggering to me and staggering for anybody to accept, but it is the reality. And that's why they continue to put fentanyl in these drugs and continue to try to increase people's addictions to it. So, a couple other things just on this chart. Again, fentanyl is very cheap, and so there's a big profit margin. When the drugs are easy to produce, you can then charge a normal amount, and people have to buy more and more of it. The drug dealers, the drug cartels make a lot of money on it. Can you develop a tolerance to fentanyl? Yes. So the people that die, who are most at risk of instantaneous death from fentanyl, are our young people, because our young people don't have a tolerance. So your biggest risk of dying from fentanyl is the first time that you take it. For users who develop a tolerance to it, you can in fact continue to take fentanyl until you ultimately overdose on it. But your body can develop a tolerance for fentanyl, and that's why ultimately the drug cartels will continue to sell it, because people will continue to buy it and continue to use it. Next slide, please. So this is just I'll play this. This is a little summary of that Commerce City case when it first happened, if we can play it.
Ryan, could you play the video?
So dangerous, investigators had to wear hazmat suits to go inside the apartment where 5 people were found dead.
Just a simple exposure to fentanyl can be lethal. And so we don't want our investigators and our detectives putting themselves in harm's way.
Brian Mason is the district attorney for the 17th Judicial District, which includes Commerce City. Police there found a woman and 4-month-old baby alive inside the apartment.
If the baby had ingested fentanyl, the baby would have perished too.
Mason says evidence inside the apartment suggests the adults were using what they probably thought was cocaine having no idea it was likely laced with fentanyl.
Particularly when it is pure fentanyl, once it gets into your system, it is too late. You can't call 911. You can't call for help. It immediately kills you.
A small amount of fentanyl cut into cocaine can give someone a lethal dose very, very quickly.
Dr. Josh Bloom works in addiction services at Denver Health. He says fentanyl overdoses are skyrocketing from just 56 in the city and county of Denver in 2019 to 159 in 2020, up to 210 in 2021.
If you take someone who is used to maybe using cocaine or a stimulant, not an opioid, who suddenly uses the amount that is frequently contained in the circulating drug, it's very likely they're going to die of an overdose.
Fentanyl is lethal and it's fast. And unfortunately, as last night tragically showed us, people don't know when they're ingesting it.
So I show that report in part to just illustrate how dangerous this can be and what an impact it has had on our neighbors and this community. But I also share it because it exposed for me a real weakness in Colorado law. And that was on multiple levels. The first one was this. We investigated that case. It was probably the biggest investigation I've been a part of. So Commerce City, the DA's office, the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Drug Enforcement Agency. We had multiple agencies involved. And it was, at the time, the biggest fentanyl death in the country. So it got a lot of attention and, honestly, more resources than I've ever seen thrown at a case before. I wish I had those kinds of resources more often. We could not charge anybody with that death, with those 5 deaths. And there were 2 reasons for that. The most important of which, legally, was this. We could not identify the source of the drugs. There were multiple sources of fentanyl that came into that apartment that night. And I had to, in order to charge someone with those deaths, identify who sold the fentanyl who sold the cocaine that was laced with the fentanyl that killed those 5 individuals. And we couldn't do it. And that was a huge disappointment to me personally, and certainly to the families of the victims who died. But it also exposed something very important, and that was, if I had been able to identify and charge someone, I didn't have the tools in our criminal code to charge them with the deaths, with killing somebody, because Colorado did not have a distribution of drugs causing death statute. And I couldn't, people ask me, why can't you charge them with first-degree murder? Well, first-degree murder, of course, any crime in the state of Colorado has certain elements that I have to meet and prove to a jury. First-degree murder requires the prosecutor to prove that the defendant, after deliberation and with intent, killed somebody. So we couldn't prove that even the few suspects that we looked into who we believe sold the fentanyl, we certainly couldn't prove that they were intentionally trying to kill these people. So first-degree murder just doesn't fit. First-degree murder doesn't fit those cases. Neither does second-degree murder. The best we could sometimes do is manslaughter. And manslaughter is a class 4 felony we have 6 classes of felony in the state of Colorado. The most people really ever get on manslaughter is maybe 3 or 4 years. So it's not a very big consequence for killing somebody. And we didn't have on the statutes in Colorado a distribution causing death, which is a tool that the federal government has that they can use to hold dealers accountable. Dealers who are selling lethal drugs and killing people in the process. It also exposed, for me, the need to change our possession laws. So possession of most Schedule I and Schedule II substances in Colorado was changed and taken out of the felony statute and moved into the misdemeanor statute in 2019. That was done before I was the district attorney, and I opposed it at the time, but I wasn't a public figure, so nobody cared what I thought. But what we were finding literally on the streets is a dealer, or really anyone, could possess up to 4 grams of any drug, including fentanyl. 4 grams of fentanyl is very, very different than 4 grams of cocaine or 4 grams of heroin. And particularly with the pills, we had dealers who were carrying around about 38 pills, which is just under 4 grams, and we could only charge them with a misdemeanor if we didn't have other indicia of distribution. And so in the 2022 legislative session, we worked very hard, and a lot of people worked really hard to address that. And next slide, please. The law that was painfully negotiated and ultimately did have bipartisan support made some pretty significant changes. One, it changed possession of fentanyl to a felony for anything over 1 gram. So possession of anything more than 1 gram of fentanyl now is a felony, and that's, in my view, a very important change in giving us in law enforcement an important tool for trying to get this poison off the streets. It also added, for the first time in Colorado's history, a distribution of fentanyl causing death statute. So that now allows me to go after dealers who deal fentanyl and kill people. I will say, parenthetically, I would like to see the legislature add more drugs to this list. It's very hard for me to look a mother in the eyes whose son or daughter died from methamphetamine or heroin and say, I can't go after that dealer for the death of your loved one because it wasn't fentanyl. If it was fentanyl, I could. So that's something I'm working on. We did introduce a bill to that that would have expanded this in the last session. It failed. But I share that with you because I think it's important, and I would encourage you all, if you agree, to advocate in future legislative sessions for that. I think it's good public policy, and I personally take dealers really seriously. The dealers are the people who are putting this poison out into the community, and we need to have tools to hold them responsible. So next slide, please. We have already been able to use this law here in Adams County in some very egregious cases where, and I can't get into the details of them too much other than our public statements, but where people have been caught distributing fentanyl, and in one case a child died, in other cases other people have died, and so we now have the tools that we need to go after them. Next slide, please. And this lists a few other examples. Of course, I just talked about the toddler. That got quite a bit of media attention. That case is still pending. We've taken down some big busts. The DEA, along with our North Metro Task Force and the DA's office, did a bust of 600,000 counterfeit pills. That was a big one. We did another one in 2021 that got $931,000 worth of currency in oxy pills. I can just tell you my intake unit, which is the unit that files all of our felony cases. So when when Chief Hubbard's team is investigating crimes in Westminster, they take the evidence of a crime and then they bring it to my office, and they put the evidence before my attorneys in my intake office, and then my attorneys make the charging decisions, and then they get assigned to a prosecuting attorney who actually takes the case to court. I would say probably a majority of our cases have some connection to fentanyl. They're not all distribution cases, of course, but people who are high on fentanyl or who are trying to get more fentanyl are committing robberies or committing motor vehicle thefts or committing violent crimes. So fentanyl is pervasive right now throughout the criminal justice system and throughout really the litany of felony charges in particular that we are prosecuting at the DA's office. So it doesn't just impact users. It doesn't just impact families who have people with addiction problems. It is impacting our crime rate across the board. And this is not unique to the 17th Judicial District. This is true nationwide. Next slide, please. So This is just some data from the Opioid Council. 80% of opioid-related overdose deaths in Adams County last year involve fentanyl. 80%. That's just a staggeringly high number, and it is an example for me of how much fentanyl has changed the game. So this chart 5 years ago would have been dramatically different. If you had looked at, we still of course had overdose deaths, but if you had looked at it then, you would have seen more of a mix of other drugs. Now it's all fentanyl. It's just all fentanyl. And not surprisingly, 69% of incarcerated people are addicted to drugs in some kind of way. Next slide. So just a little bit of an overview of some of the things that we're doing at the DA's office that I just want you to know about and would invite your questions and thoughts on. When I took office, I created a drug trafficking unit and hired, who I'm not unbiased on this issue, but I hired the best drug prosecutor in the state. I stole her from the AG's office. Phil Weiser is still upset with me about it. But we dramatically changed how we were prosecuting drug cases and really going after the big fish. And one of my roles as the district attorney by law is I have to personally approve wiretaps. So a wiretap is when we ask the court for permission to listen to people's phone calls. And that, of course, is a huge intrusion. And so we have big guardrails in place for that. And so I have to approve each and every one of those. And they're confidential. I can't tell you about them, but I can tell you this. It's staggering to me what people are trying to get away with in this community. And when you do have a wiretap, a legal wiretap up and running, it's fascinating to listen to what they're saying to each other and to listen and to watch the criminal enterprise take place before your eyes. But we are aggressively using these tools to go after the big fish in ways that I don't believe our office has ever done before, and I'm proud of that. And we're using these new tools that we worked hard to get. The North Metro Task Force, which of course the Westminster Police Department is a part of, has been building some very strong prosecutable cases that we work hand in glove with them on. We're also really trying to do a lot of what tonight is about, which is educating. And I encourage and ask you all to take opportunities in the city of Westminster when you're out to educate people about fentanyl. It surprises me sometimes to still hear parents talk to me and not know what fentanyl is. Any parent in this community has to warn their kids about fentanyl. Any parent. It is that scary. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to help inform people about that. You can read the rest of that if you wish. Next slide. So, why don't we stop there, and I can take some questions on fentanyl, and then if there's time, we'll get to some of the other interesting topics.
Oh, sorry, Councilor Seymour?
Thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Pleasure.
You touched on Metro North Drug Task Force.
Yes.
How critical is that to success as far as working interagency like that?
It's critical. I can tell you that there were some challenges when I took office with some history with North Metro Task Force and relationships with other agencies. And we've navigated that, and by hiring a terrific person who also had great relationships with our federal partners, I think we've been able to establish a working relationship that is the most productive it has ever been. I don't know if, Norm, you have an opinion on that.
I would completely agree. I mean, not having North Metro Task Force and do what they do, we would be a small fish in a big ocean with what we're dealing with. And the criminals don't know excuse me. The criminals don't know borders, and so not being a part of a larger task force would really hinder what we do on a larger scale.
It dramatically impacts our scope. The Westminster Police Department has fantastic people, but to do a wiretap requires a whole extra level of expertise and time and resources that the North Metro Task Force has, and that if we didn't have agencies joining that, we wouldn't be able to take on these big investigations.
Mr. Rosati?
Thanks for the presentation. I have a few questions. Is there specific data to Westminster for fentanyl that we can see?
I think we can find some. I don't have them for you tonight, but that's actually coming up in my chart. The DA's office just earlier this month, or actually in July, put out or published what we're calling our data dashboard. So DA's offices across Colorado have started really a national model of sharing our data. And I can tell you in the nearly 17 years that I've been in this job, DA's offices don't do a very good job collecting data. We just don't. And we haven't done a very good job of not just collecting it, but because we don't collect it well, we're not able to analyze it and use it to help make decisions. That's all changing. Every DA's office in the state uses, this gets a little wonky, I'm sorry, but every DA's office in Colorado uses a program called Action, which we use to prosecute our cases. And it tracks everything. It tracks what the charges are. It tracks, it's how we do our discovery process. Discovery for non-lawyers, there's no reason for you to know this word, but discovery is the evidence that we are required to turn over to the defense. So everything that the Westminster Police Department turns over to the DA's office for a case, I'm required to then turn over to the defense attorney. And we have done all of that now in a streamlined fashion through this action program. Well, because of that, we can now mine the data from this program in my office and in the Jefferson County DA's office and in the Denver DA's office and pull from that all this interesting information that we've never had access to before. And we just put it all out on our website. So I think that we will be able to zero in on specific municipalities. I haven't figured that out just yet, but that is something that I can work on and get back to you on.
Thank you. Second question, synthetic opioids, are there other pretty dangerous synthetic opioids that are a problem right now? Or is fentanyl the...
Yes, the answer is yes, and the answer is not. It's one that will scare you. It continues to scare me. We get different iterations of fentanyl every few months. So there are higher potency versions of fentanyl that the drug cartels are working on and selling now in our community. So yes, the synthetic opioid problem is not getting better, it's getting worse.
Is fentanyl the main one that they keep upgrading?
Without question. Yep.
And the last question on so the physiological mechanism of death, is it like respiratory, depression? Is it cardiac? So what is it exactly?
Yeah,
for fentanyl?
I should be more of an expert on this than I am.
Respiratory.
It's respiratory?
Yeah, can't breathe.
Good to have a pharmacist in.
Thank you for that.
Thanks.
Mayor Pro Tem.
First, thank you for being here and for your work on this. This is something that I have made a lot of noise about in my time on council, and unfortunately, a lot of this becoming the problem it is has been while I've been here. Early on in my time, I had a friend who OD'd on some sort of opioid. In general, that's been a problem for our communities, and like you've said, a lot of times people, that's not their intent. They're chasing that high.
Yeah.
And it's I think you said it well. It's very frightening. So to see the work that you've done and advocate for better penalties is something that I was certainly on board with and doing myself to whatever level I could. I think it's frustrating that drug dealers don't care if you have an RRD by your name or you or anything else. And unfortunately, this topic has been too politicized over the last handful of years. So I'm glad to see everybody's rowing in the same direction and trying to figure out how do we actually solve this problem. Because like you've said, this is not just that problem. I know that when we talked about auto theft, it was the same thing. It's not that they're stealing a cheap car, they're chasing a high and they're trying to fuel that and or robbing people's cars or whatever else. That's a conversation that this council has had many times. So for whatever it's worth, thank you for the work that you've done. The mayor and I both got to attend a meeting with AG Weiser around this topic, and there were some county commissioners and folks from the state that were there. And they talked about some of the outreach efforts that they're doing to educate youth, and kind of take the stigma away so that you can have that real conversation around it. Because a lot of times with youth, if they're using drugs, they don't want to talk about it with you. And so I think it's important that we, have those kind of programs. So what is your office doing in that realm? Are you working with AG Weiser's office on his efforts, or, what is there some public outreach from the DA's office, since you obviously see all the damage it's causing, which is, I think, impactful to our community to learn that?
Yeah, we have aggressively tried to reach out to the community on this issue. Our goal is to get into schools. I can tell you candidly, when I first took office, we were still in COVID. And then once kids were back in schools, they didn't have a lot of bandwidth for lots of visits from the DA's office to talk about these things. So that's a real goal of mine, is to do a better job of getting into the schools. But we have aggressively done public outreach in terms of social media and presentations and public speaking engagements like this one to try to spread the word.
I think that's good, and I appreciate hearing that, because to me that's vital, because, teenagers are going to try stuff, and them understanding and being able to have a safe conversation with people who are in the know to say, you think you're trying this, but here's the reality of how often this happens, is I think it's critical if we want to at least save some young people.
Agreed, and I guess I'll just follow that up with saying, I think school districts are in a unique position to help us spread the word on this. I spoke at a Aurora Public Schools event, I think it was a year ago now. They held it at a high school, and it was about fentanyl. And that high school auditorium was packed with adults who were there to learn more because they're afraid for their kids. I'd love to see Westminster do something like that. Right. Right.
The other thing I wanted to ask about, and it's kind of along the same lines of what Councilor Zadi was wondering, I follow some of the other PD social media in the area, and I hate to say it, but not surprisingly, just because of the highways they have going through there, I think Wheat Ridge often will have posts from their PD with, large caches of drugs and guns that they're pulling out of cars. Are we seeing that same kind of traffic through our city on, and I've heard this before going through the Citizen Academy, when you talk about just Colorado, where we are for transport with drugs, and we have major highways going through there, so it comes through our state. So, I'm assuming that Westminster or Wheat Ridge is probably not alone in that. Are we seeing that same kind of traffic through our highway system?
Mayor Pro Tem, thanks for the question. We are seeing some of those, some of the influx of drugs coming through. Not surprising. This year, a lot of our stuff, the way we chart and graph the confiscation of the drugs is usually through the task force, because they're the ones that take the case. This year, in our agency alone, we've confiscated more than 16,000 pills of the M30 fentanyl. But you compare that, comparatively speaking, to the entire task force, and the task force is measuring those seizures this year in hundreds of thousands of pills. So we are seeing them, but again, some of that is I'll say a little bit muddied in our stats, just as the way we file the cases, because they're turned over to them. But as it relates to the stats, in speaking with both of the coroners, so in 2022 in Adams County, we as Westminster had 12 fentanyl-related deaths, fentanyl being the proximate cause of death. Now, was that an accidental overdose? Was that a suicide? That information is not shared, but that specific number was 12 on the Adams County side, and it was 4 on the Jefferson County side. So they measure them a little bit differently, but ultimately we had 16 fatal deaths because of fentanyl, and obviously one is too much, and so we were absolutely out there doing those things, but we have seen a huge uptick in the amount of drugs.
I'll just add to that, if I may, that we've had a paradigm shift within law enforcement on how we investigate these cases. For many years, when someone died from fentanyl, or really any drug overdose, most of my law enforcement agencies that I work with would give condolences to parents and maybe give them a resource for the coroner's office, but would not investigate it. And that was in part because we didn't always treat overdoses as crimes that other people were part of. And we didn't have the statutory charges to actually go after people for that. So that's been a shift. In terms of your question, Mayor Pro Tem, Colorado is without question, because of our crisscrossing highways, a big stop on the road for drugs that are traveling across the country, and they don't stay in Wheat Ridge. They, without question, come into this community.
A few last things. One, I'd say that, I think it's difficult too for our communities, for anybody listening. I mean, we have a cultural difference now in Colorado with our, marijuana being legal, what they did with mushrooms. That, to me, it hasn't always been by itself. If somebody does marijuana, they're going to do other things. But with the youth, it definitely changes, to a different level where it's only one thing away from what, they already are trying, that maybe they don't have the same stigma about that you did before marijuana was legal. And I've seen that challenge for our state and the way things have progressed. The last thing I'd ask you, and this is just to ask for you, and you don't have to answer this now, but one of the things that we've done is work with our police department and our courts and our attorney to say, what could we do as a city legislatively in order to kind of attack some of this stuff. And so I'm sure you've seen, we did some different things around street racing, around auto theft, and some other areas. I guess it just would leave the open door, whether it's tonight or beyond, how we can help you do your work, because obviously we are in the same fight together, and I appreciate the things you do. So I want to make sure that there's that opportunity and open ear to you.
Thank you. It's a very thoughtful question. I'll try to think on that and give you a more thoughtful answer. I guess my first request is to help me get the word out. I really ask that everybody in public office talk about fentanyl so that parents and kids are aware of it. In terms of other ways we can support each other, let me think.
Councilor Namella?
Two questions. So first, want to thank you, but I'm also horrified over the information you've given us, but it's not something I didn't already know, but it's good to know that you are doing more towards addressing it for us. A question first for Chief Hubbard. With respect to education at our schools, I don't know what the capacity is of the DA's office, but can the SROs, or do the SROs already engage in some of this education?
They work with the school districts, and they do engage in some of this education, specifically about fentanyl, but more a bigger picture about drugs in general. It depends on the school district, and they're also looking at other opportunities with the co-responders and some of that substance abuse piece in counseling that they have, and bringing some of those other opportunities that they have to the schools for better education.
That is good to know. What was my second question? Sadly, I didn't write my second question down. That is so, God. Okay, it might come.
That's not like you.
Yeah, I know, right?
I understand the babies and those that can't get out of the area where this is happening, but how young have we seen, think of elementary to high school, how young does fentanyl get to?
We've had them at practically every age. So there's really no safe age. And in the very tragic cases where young children have died, from babies to 4 or 5-year-olds, it's typically children of drug dealers. And yet a low-level user who leaves fentanyl out amongst young children is also putting those children's lives at risk.
Just remembered my question, because it was kind of like that.
Okay.
So with with school age kids, is it, the exposure to fentanyl, is it something that's more, inadvertent, or is it usually, somebody who's seeking out some other type of drug or some type of experiment with drugs? I'm just kind of, how much of the exposure to kids is not something like accidental or something that they're just first time exposed to and they're not like typical drug users?
Yes. Most of our deaths of high school kids or college kids or people from age 13 to 22 are folks who are trying something for the first time and not necessarily knowing that they're taking fentanyl. And that's where the education piece is so important. And that's why I use the phrase "no drug is safe," because you really can be experimenting with an oxy pill and thinking it's just gonna give you a brief high and you can lose your life because of it. So, but all of those pills or all of these drugs are gateway drugs to more addiction. And I just met with a gentleman from California, actually, who had come out here to talk to some policymakers who had a family of 5, I think, nice house in San Francisco. I can't remember what he did for a living, but he did well. And he had surgery and was given oxy for the pain, and then got addicted. And then started buying it clandestinely because the doctors wouldn't prescribe him anymore. And then got addicted to fentanyl and was out on the streets. So it can hit absolutely anybody from any education level, from any class, from any race. This drug does not discriminate. It'll get anybody who gets introduced to it.
Mayor Persham asked my question about how are we communicating with schools, since you said education is the biggest piece to this. But that kind of stemmed from his last question. This question stemmed from his last one about how we can be helpful to you. If you can your office create some kind of boilerplate information that we can provide in our newsletters, in our social media, that it's essentially like a media kit,
Yeah.
where it has like a press release or social media that we can honestly like directly pull from, that's your words coming straight from you, or with the contact of how to get in touch with your office?
Absolutely. Every fair I go to, I hand out brochures on fentanyl, so I can get you a whole stack of them.
Yeah,
And
that,
we've got social
anything to
media
help,
ones too.
like, just make it easy for us to
Absolutely.
hand out, that'd be great.
Done. Tony will get on that for me.
If I had some by Friday, I'd take them to our movie in the park, because we'll have plenty of parents.
We'll get some to you.
Anything else?
Nope.
You're along the same line as me, but city manager, is there any way, I know we put this out as a meeting with the other presentations coming. Is there any way to take this meeting with all the questions, everything that we're discussing, and keep that, but let our social media folks put that out so people don't feel like they have to go through all of the meeting, but they can at least get this piece?
Absolutely, Mayor, and we can also put it on our
Website.
newly operational Westy TV Channel 8
Yeah.
and run it. So we've got some options,
Okay.
but yeah, I would agree, this is a great opportunity
Yeah.
to spread the word.
And I will also tell you, I will come anywhere you ask me to go. I'll come to town halls, I'll come to a public meeting and do a much condensed version of this if you want. Any place that you would like, I'll be there to talk to people about this.
And then a disturbing thing for me personally, I had a family member, had to have it was a rough surgery, but could not get out of the hospital until they accepted the oxycodone prescription. The way to get out was he had to take that with him. He never used a pill of it, but he had to take it in order to get released. That is nuts.
You're not the first person that's told me that. I've heard that multiple times. I actually had a big surgery in May. I had both of my hips replaced, which I don't recommend. And I also was sent home with a big bottle of oxys.
You went over and over saying, I don't want that stuff, isn't there something else?
Right.
I'm pretty good with pain tolerance. And they said, if you want out of here, you have to take it. That's just nuts to me, but, thank you. And let's get into your other stuff was interesting.
Okay, great. So next slide then. I talked a little bit about the data dashboard. This really is a first of its kind. We've never done this before, and there's really nobody else doing it nationwide. Colorado is unique because our DA's offices all happen to use the same database. That we had this collaboration with the University of Denver and Loyola in Chicago and the National Prosecutorial Performance Project. They got a big grant and they've put this project together. And so, next slide, please. I think this is just kind of an example of what I can do now, which I couldn't do before. And we can transition into the discussion about motor vehicle theft, but let me just say again, this data dashboard is up on our website. It's adamsbroomfieldda.org, and you can access all kinds of things that, good or bad, about the criminal justice system and about our caseloads, and it can do breakdown of gender, racial ethnicity, like all of the things that people are concerned about. We're putting it all out there for people to see. This, of course, is a staggeringly concerning chart about motor vehicle theft. And motor vehicle theft has absolutely skyrocketed nationwide, and Colorado has the unfortunate distinction of having the highest number of motor vehicle thefts per capita anywhere in the country. And Adams County is near the top of that list. So I know you all have been very engaged on the motor vehicle theft issue because it has impacted Westminster very directly. My personal engagement on this has been about changing the law. So we had a huge disparity in the law in terms of charging, as I'm sure you probably know. I could only charge someone with a crime. The level of crime depended on the cost of the car. So that meant if somebody stole a 2021 Tesla, I could charge them with a felony. But if they stole a 2005 Honda Accord, I could only charge them with a misdemeanor. And the people who are driving the 2005 Honda Accords are the least able to replace those cars when they get stolen, and they also are the most impacted when they can't get to their job or when they can't get their kids to school. And so that was a real problem and a real discrepancy in the law, which we were able to change, and I'm helped write the bill. There's a part of that bill that I also helped write that is actually more impactful, and it has gotten less attention, but I'll just share with you. We in law enforcement struggle with these cases. We have like a 6% solve rate. So even though the numbers are staggeringly high, it's really hard to solve these cases. And when we do solve them, getting the case from fileable case to conviction is also very hard. Well, why is that? One of the major reasons why is what the law required me to prove. And so the law in most crimes has two huge elements. I'm going to give you some Latin here. The actus reus and the mens rea. The actus reus is the act itself, so the stealing of the car. The mens rea is the mental state of the person who commits the crime. So with murder, again, I have to prove that the person deliberated and intentionally shot and killed somebody. So with motor vehicle theft, the law required us to prove that the person who was caught in a stolen car knew that the car was stolen, that they knowingly did it. Now that sounds like that wouldn't be that hard to prove. However, with the change in technology, fewer and fewer of our stolen cars have shaved ignitions. fewer and fewer cars have indicia of having been stolen, because people can just use their little clickers. We have people who actually steal clickers from our auto dealerships and then go around and try to use them to open up cars. And so when one of Chief Haubert's patrol officers stops someone and the car is stolen, we know that it's stolen, the license plate has been reported as stolen, the person says, oh, well, I got this car from Abby. She didn't tell me she'd stolen it. And we charge them, if we can, and we put it in front of a jury, and the jury, I have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt each of these elements, and juries aren't convicting. And so we really needed some easing of the mental state. And we pushed hard for that in the law, and now the law, starting in July, it did pass, is that the person knew or should have known. That's a dramatic change for us in the prosecution community. Because now when somebody says, and you know they're lying, but if somebody says, oh, I didn't know this car was stolen, we can still charge them and hopefully convict them by saying, well, you should have known. You know, you don't have access to a 2020 Honda. So I'm hopeful that that will help us with this. This is a huge problem. In the last couple of months, we've started to see it tick back down. I'm hoping that that's a change that will continue. But we're certainly aggressively prosecuting these cases. And anybody who tells you differently, just come check out our data dashboard. We are filing more of these cases than we've ever filed before. We're going to trial on more of them than we ever have before. But they are difficult cases to prove. And that's just a reality. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've already talked about this. Next slide. Okay, one of the things that keeps me up at nights and that I also talk about almost as much as fentanyl is youth violence, and specifically youth and guns. We are seeing more violent gun-related crimes committed by juveniles than ever before. And you can see on this chart just the number of cases in 2022 and the difference between 2022 and 2021 when it comes to youth violence and guns. And I will just tell you anecdotally, last fall we had 3 back-to-back weekends where we had house parties that turned into gunfights. And I went out on all of these scenes. And unfortunately, in my line of work, in our line of work, it's not unusual for murders to happen. It's just part of what we do. What was unusual about each of these cases is that we had between 30 and 100 kids in these houses from the ages of 15 to 21. And after the first person brought out a gun and shot someone, 4 or 5 other kids brought their guns out too. And it was like the Wild West, the shootout. And that's a change. That's unusual. And the proliferation of stolen guns that kids are getting access to and then using in these crimes scares me. And I can tell you, we have right now in the DA's office in Adams and Broomfield, in the 17th Judicial District, about 30,000 cases. Of those 30, 30. Of
000?
correct. Of those 30,000, about 7,000 to 8,000 are felonies, and the rest are misdemeanors. When I look at those numbers and focus in on the juvenile cases, these are the numbers that are just skyrocketing. And so why did I share all that? I apologize. I lost my train of thought for a second. As the district attorney, I don't personally file all those 30,000 cases. That's why I have my intake office. But I personally make the decisions on every homicide. And I have filed homicide cases in the last 2 years for a homicide that was committed over a purse, a homicide that was committed over a pair of jeans, a homicide that was committed over a girlfriend. So kids are fighting about the same things that we all fought about. And this makes me sound old when I talk like this. But kids are fighting about the same things that kids have fought about for time immemorial. Girls, jeans, purses, whatever, but they're bringing guns to the fight. And it's frightening. And I share that with you so you just know that you know that it's happening. And this is also something that we have to get the word out to parents, to know where your kids are going, where they're hanging out. Every single one of those house parties, we had parents say afterwards, I didn't know my child was at a party with so many kids without an adult present. Yes, sir.
I'm just curious, I'm looking at this curve here, what do you attribute that to? Because it's interesting that these numbers dropped pretty substantially, say from 2018 to 2021, and then so much higher in 2022.
Yeah.
And the other part of that question that I'm curious about, in these instances, and you mentioned, just in general that, they're getting access to stolen guns. But in most of these cases, is that, what you're seeing, that, because obviously they're not old enough to have a firearm,
Correct.
so they're already, there's a law being broken, but, can you dig in a little bit more and explain, because, trying to understand what the solve is. Being, obviously I'm somebody who's fairly adamant about my support of the Second Amendment. However, I also think that we need to apply the law, and there's a reason that people of certain ages aren't allowed to have, these particular things. So I'm trying to understand it a little bit better.
I appreciate the question, and candidly, I'm trying to understand it better too. It's happening nationwide, so it's not unique just to Colorado or certainly to Adams County. And I'm well aware of the difficult conversation that our country always has about guns. Why do I bring this up? Because most of us agree that kids shouldn't have guns. And these are not legal guns that they're using. Most of them are stolen. Some of them are candidly, some of them get them from family members who haven't properly and safely secured their weapons. But what we see more often is stolen guns or ghost guns. And ghost guns are a real challenge because we in law enforcement, when somebody gets a ghost gun, it hasn't gone through any kind of a background check. Doesn't have a serial number on it. And so we can't even tell you that it's stolen, because if it's a ghost gun, we can't trace it at all. So those are some of the factors that we deal with. Why are the numbers so high? I wish I had an answer to that. Here's my speculation. I think the mental health crisis in this country is at an all-time high, and I think our kids are suffering the most from it, and I think they're still figuring life out after COVID. And I think that's led to some behaviors, including violent behaviors, that we're seeing acted out in some of these cases. And I don't have a good solution to that.
Well, so I guess
I don't have numbers to back that up, though, Counselor. That's me speculating.
But to follow it up, I think I wouldn't disagree with anything you said. This is really for both you, the community in general, and probably law enforcement and our SROs. They're used to, and it's such a nerdy thing to bring up DARE anymore, which I think is funny. Maybe that's showing my age, but, to me, it's the same challenge that we need to tackle with the youth specifically when it's around drugs. It's education. You are making a permanent decision that will alter your life and somebody else's permanently over something that's probably a temporary heartache. Say in the instance of a girlfriend, or you're mad somebody has nicer jeans than you, which is crazy, but I mean, it's the real reality of the things that you mentioned. So I guess I would challenge us all, including, our SRO, to think through that when we have the conversations around drugs. This is the same thing to me. I mean, kids need to, have somebody, unfortunately, step back, because a lot of times, I don't know if this isn't happening at home anymore, but, it's something that I certainly was raised with. Don't make permanent decisions over, temporary problems. And so, for whatever it's worth, I do think we need to address it the same way that we're addressing the drug conversation we had earlier, because, they're kids, their brains aren't developed the same, and they're making bad choices. So I think it's part of the solution. It's probably not the whole thing, but it certainly is something that is within our control that we can try to tackle.
I'm going to just skip the last 3 slides. They're examples of things that you can find on our data dashboard. But I do want to just address two other quick things, because I know I'm almost surely over my time. One is a juvenile assessment center. So for the last several years, the 17th Judicial District has had something called the Link. You've heard of the Link? Well, we are required under the law to have a juvenile assessment center that law enforcement can bring kids to after they've been picked up. And they can be picked up and charged with a crime, or they can be picked up for other reasons. And they're brought to a juvenile assessment center to essentially do exactly what the title sounds like, assess the juvenile and figure out where they should go next. Do they go to jail? Do they go back to their home? And I should have introduced my colleague Tony Wayman, who's my chief of policy and public affairs at the DA's office. She was essentially running the Link for a while when the director left. And in short, it closed. And it closed a month or two ago?
Beginning of May.
So this judicial district right now does not have a juvenile assessment center at all that is functioning, which means our law enforcement agencies are left in a real bind when they're picking up kids. And so it is essentially an emergent problem. And some of our sister jurisdictions, Arapahoe County, Jeffco, have fabulous juvenile assessment centers. We just really haven't in this community come together and put in the resources and the staff. And that's one of many reasons why the Link failed. We're gonna have a little summit on Friday at the DA's office. We've invited essentially everybody who's interested, from superintendents to police chiefs to city managers, and any member of any city council in the 17th Judicial District is welcome to come as well. My hope is by the end of the day on Friday, we're gonna have a plan for creating a new juvenile assessment center in this jurisdiction. I'm sharing that with you, one, so that you know what's happening, and two, because we're gonna have to pay for it. And that's gonna require every jurisdiction in the 17th who wants to participate to help pay. So I'm putting that on your radar. And then a more long-term goal, one of the things that I'm most proud of, what we're doing at the DA's office, is how we're addressing domestic violence. Domestic violence skyrocketed during the pandemic, and it's without question one of the biggest problems that we confront in law enforcement. And we were able to get a federal grant last year to create what we're calling the Domestic Violence High Risk Team. And that high risk team, are you part of that yet?
No.
We started, it was a pilot program in Thornton, and we've expanded it, and we're gonna bring every city into it. That high risk team is identifying domestic violence victims who have the highest lethality risk and getting them services right away. And it's having some really good success. My hope is that this domestic violence team, high risk team, is a building block towards a future family justice center. And if you've never heard that term, let me just be the first to share with you that a family justice center is a one-stop shop for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. And they come into a family justice center and they have every resource there that they need. They have law enforcement and the DA's office, but they also have family law attorneys or immigration attorneys. Why is that important? Sometimes victims of domestic violence won't cooperate with the prosecution because they rely on their abuser for paying the rent or paying the mortgage or putting food on the table for the kids. And so we struggle. Over 50% of domestic violence victims don't cooperate with prosecutions. So that means a majority of domestic violence offenders, unless they take some kind of a plea, can get away with it. And we're trying to address that. And so my hope is to bring a family justice center to Adams County and to the 17th Judicial District. And that's not as emergent as the Juvenile Assessment Center, but my hope is to do that, and I would love to have you all be a part of it and to be a part of that process. Any other questions for me on any topic? thank you for
I loved
all
your
of the time.
extra slides. They help put in perspective the negative that you hear out there to the truth.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
So thank you so much for taking this much time. Yeah, I could sit here all night and listen to you, but any other final questions, thoughts? We can't thank you enough, and we will do everything.
She had one.
Oh,
You
sorry.
missed one hand.
Every time you turn around, I'm like too
It's like a
late.
game.
So just a quick question regarding the Family Justice Center. I was familiar with, when I was working out in California, there was one that Santa Clara had that was just for like women of domestic violence, and it was a kind of a protected housing
Yeah.
project. I'm just kind of curious, is that part of what that concept might
Great
include?
question. So we don't have a domestic violence shelter in Adams County, and it's a gaping hole. A family justice center isn't supposed to be a shelter, but it's possible that we will try to fill both of those needs in this conversation. Thank you.
We'll do everything in our power to get the message out to the right people.
Thank you so much.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate all of your hard work on all of these issues and the ones that cross your desks, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Keep going or break?
You good? Okay,
Good?
go.
Okay.
Yeah, if it doesn't take
Okay,
too long.
so, Mayor Pro Tem, councilors, our next agenda topic is specifically focused on Rocky Mountain Municipal Airport. And this question started earlier this summer about leaded fuel versus not leaded fuel, et cetera. And so what we've coordinated for tonight are two separate presentations. And so this is not a battle of the bands. This is receive first presentation, dismiss the speaker, receive second presentation. Both presentations are for information purposes, but we're trying to provide you both sides of the story. And so our first presentation is Dr. Robert Boutel. He's a subject matter expert on the topic, and he's previously spoken to the town of Superior about this topic. I think he's a resident of Superior or nearby, right?
Yep.
And so we wanted to hear his perspective on lead-based fuels, and then when he's finished and you've asked your questions, we've also coordinated for the airport director, Paul Anslow, to speak about kind of where our MMA is going regarding leaded fuel moving in the future. But without any further ado, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Boutel for graciously accepting our invitation. We look forward to hearing your presentation, so thank you again.
Of course. Again, my name is Robert Patel, and as mentioned before, my job here is just to help educate and disseminate a lot of the literature involved with leaded avgas fuel, so that way you can make an informed decision with respect to leaded impacts in your community. So we'll go to the next slide. I can talk a little bit about my background. So I received high honors in chemistry in my undergraduate institute. I received a PhD in materials chemistry from UCLA, where I received a dissertation award for my work there. My advisor specialized in embedding nanomaterials inside of cell membranes as biosensors, which will become important later. And I heavily focused on leaded materials such as lead sulfide and lead selenide, working at HRL labs to create these nanocrystals for military applications. And I finally came out to Colorado to work at the National Institute of Standards and Technology down in Boulder when I received a prestigious fellowship to work there. So I do not consider myself the highest authority on this subject matter in all of Colorado. That would be Dr. Zaran, who actually led the study of Reed Hillview Airport and a study of the Flint, Michigan water crisis. But I'll do my best to help inform you on the subject. I also have other people who helped create this presentation, including some environmental scientists, some data scientists for some of the maps, and also some doctors as well. So we can kind of go in further to the next slide to talk about what is toxicity and how is it with lead. So toxicity can be thought about in three main factors: how much you're exposed to the compound itself, how much material is required to affect the body, and how readily is a toxin incorporated into the body, and how quickly can your body detoxify it. So first we'll talk about exposure, how much we're actually exposed to the lead. Now, I wouldn't be sitting in front of you if you weren't already being, at least your residents were exposed to lead. So we can go to the next slide. We can look at the proximity of Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport with respect to your Westminster community. Highlighted here is Walnut Grove. You can see Countryside as well. Green Knolls is just off the runway in the airport critical zone of Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport. And just for transparency of where I'm coming from, that's roughly where my house is over there, over in Rock Creek. You can go to the next transition. So because these piston aviation aircrafts use leaded fuel, the lead has to go somewhere, and that's in the exhaust. So oftentimes with these heavy patterned work that continue to go over the community, these touch and go patterns from Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport, we will see touch and go patterns where planes will circle over your neighborhoods over and over and over again. And every single time a plane goes over you, that is lead exposure. Over a park, over a school, over a home, that is lead exposure from the emissions from the airport itself. And I've actually highlighted a few areas of interest, mainly being the schools, because children are most vulnerable to this lead exposure. Now, this is just a picture from September of 2020, looking at specifically just the touch and go patterns here. Since then, we have seen an explosion of growth at the airport, so we can go to the next transition. In 2020, the number of operations per year were about 190,000, and in 2022, it ballooned to 262,000 operations per year, which is an extremely high number of operations at the airport, which means much higher exposure to your residents at large. Now, I am conflating some of these numbers, so 262 also includes the commercial, but we will be focusing on a more direct comparison, which is the avgas fuel sales at Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport in a bit. We can go to the next slide. So if you want to take some averages, so for those operations, if you want to take an average of how much exposure is actually happening, there's 718 operations per day, 30 operations per hour, or 1 operation every 2 minutes if you were to operate in a 24-hour cycle. So you are being exposed very, very, very often to this lead emissions. Now we can go to the next slide. So we talked about how there is lead in the fuel, and this comes from tetraethyl lead, a substance that was banned in car fuel back in the 60s due to the health effects in the environment. Last year in 2022, Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport, which I'll refer to as RMA often, sold 2,406, sorry, not 4,006, sold 541,993 gallons of fuel avgas fuel last year. Now this corresponds to 2,406 pounds of lead emissions over the surrounding communities. That's 1.25 tons of lead over the surrounding communities. And conservation of mass dictates that it must go somewhere. So if we go to the next transition, it's going to go into the surrounding communities. And this is a map of 2021, still not 2022, just of June, if I'm reading that correctly, of the piston aviation air traffic over the surrounding communities. And this is just 1 month of exposure. And this goes on year-round, month after month, day after day in your surrounding communities. So you are being exposed to this lead from this aviation fuel. If we go to the next slide. Now, how concerned should we be? Well, it turns out that 80% of fuel is used in the, or higher, is used in the takeoff and climb out section of the landing takeoff cycle. So for during a touch and go pattern, you're going to need to rev your engine and burn fuel in order to gain altitude in the takeoff section. You have Green Knolls, which is in the airport critical zone, which is going to emit a lot of, you'll have a lot of takeoff and fuel burning in those locations. And you also have Walnut Grove and Countryside in the climb out section of the touch and goes as they're trying to create altitude in these touch and go patterns. And this is where 80% of lead emissions are released during this phase. So you're going to get a lot of this lead in the local communities compared to those further away. So you're going to be heavily impacted by this lead. If we go to the next slide. So we in Superior were concerned about this emission of lead. We knew that there was lead in the fuel, but we didn't know how much it was impacting our community. So we got together with an environmental scientist who went through and was trying to determine and quantify how much lead we are going to find in our homes and in our environment. Because if you're exposed to this lead, it can cause, you can get it into your system and you can get it into your blood, which can cause health effects further down the line. So we found 9 volunteer homes, and we decided to look at window sills and window tracks. This was specifically because if you look at the soil samples, you aren't going to find anything because it's going to be diluted by the vegetation and it's going to be diluted by the soil itself. So, because you're looking for a very, very small amount of emissions. So we looked at windowsills because if you open up your windows for fresh air on in, you're going to get some dust, but you're also going to get deposition of these exhausts in your house as well. So we didn't know what to expect. We were kind of expecting that some of the houses closer to the airport would show some signs of lead. We expected those further away would maybe show nothing at all. We weren't too sure what we were expecting. We just were curious and wanted to know. So if you go to the next transition, we found that every single house, every single sample, all 18 samples contained high amounts of lead. One more transition. The highest sample was one of the houses that was closest to the airport, and that was about twice the amount I'm showing here, about 5.4 micrograms. 5.4 micrograms was the house that was actually the 4th highest sample of lead in the area. So this was astounding and a shock to me, mainly because the amount of material we're seeing versus the amount of dust we are weighing and measuring. So we're looking at dust in these windowsills. And if you think about dust and you rub your finger along your windowsill or your window and you look at how much it is, you know it's not a kilogram. You know it's probably not a gram. Coffee drinkers might know that the golden ratio for grounds to water is about 7 grams per cup of water or 1 scoop. And that's about 7 grams of coffee grounds. We're talking about milligrams of sample, and we're finding micrograms of lead in the area. Some might say that sounds insignificant, but as we'll find out later, that is very significant that we're finding this just in a windowsill. You can go on to the next slide. So it became a question of, well, where did this lead come from? Some people, and this is very, very important to go through slowly and to understand, because there's a lot of misinformation out there, and I've seen a lot of things online that's misrepresenting the facts or just making blatantly false statements. So there's a question of, well, did this lead come from the Marshall Fire? And luckily, we didn't have to do soil samples for this. Boulder County graciously went over and did soil samples for most of the area after the Marshall Fire. And they looked at the top 3 inches of soil, and they looked at the next 3 inches of soil below. If lead came from the fire, they would expect to see a higher amount of lead on the top surface compared to the bottom surface below. They found, as you can see here on the figure, that the top 3 inches and the bottom 3 inches showed no significant change. In fact, the bottom 3 inches were actually higher in concentration in lead compared to the top 3. So this lead deposition did not come from the Marshall Fire. The second thing I often hear is that, well, this lead must have come from the natural abundance of lead in the area, or came from cars 100 years ago before it was banned, and it was just left over and around. That's not physically possible either, due to the concentration that we see here and that we saw on the windowsills. So this is a parts per million measurement right here. These numbers are parts per million, meaning if we found a milligram of this dust in the windowsill, we would expect a nanogram, 1,000 times less of lead in that windowsill. So it's not physically possible for just dust from the outside coming on in and us finding magically 5 micrograms of material. If the dust on the surface matched that outside, that would be parts per 1,000 times more concentrated, and we would be considered a Superfund site. The EPA would come on in and say, you can't build residences here, you have to basically mitigate and basically amend the soil because it's not safe. There's too much lead in the environment. So, to recap, we know that it's not from the fires, and we know it's not from the naturally abundant amount of lead in the area. So where did it come from? It must have come from a high lead emission source in the area that mixed in with the dust, creating that high concentration on those windowsills. So we go to the next slide. Now, the National Emission Inventory talks about the various sources of lead in the area. So you can see Superior's in the center right there, and you can see 2 values, 0.03 and 0.28. These are in pounds per year. The 0.03 comes from a boiler factor, I believe, that is no longer in use, while the 0.28 is used by is emissions from the nearby hospital due to emergency helicopter rides, because the helicopters use avgas as well, and they emit about 0.28 pounds per year. The big ones, 598, is Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport from 2017. The other one, 526, is the Erie Airport, and 284 is the Boulder Airport up in the top left. But the major sources of emissions in the area are the local airports, and the major source of emission close to Westminster and close to Superior is the airport. So far I've only shown you how we can determine that this lead came from the airport just via process of elimination. However, if you want to take it a step further, there are methods to actually speciate the lead. Due to the unique characteristics of the emissions from the exhaust itself, there are methods to determine that yes, it did come from piston aviation airplanes, and yes, definitively, it did come from the airport. It gets a little bit too technical to go into right now, but if that is a path you want to pursue, I can go through the details and the methods of how to actually do that. So we can go on to the next section. So I talked about how we are being exposed to this and from the airport. Now the question is, how much is required to actually affect the human body? Go on to the next slide. You can go like 2 more clicks. Perfect. So I'm going to concentrate mainly at those who are most at risk, and those are children and expecting mothers. So because of the fact that once lead gets into your body, it starts affecting the calcium pathways and neurons in your body, those children are the most affected because you're trying to create those neural interconnects, you're trying to learn, you're trying to develop behavioral interactions. But the lead causes disruption of that. Therefore, it leads to lower IQ, decreased attention span in schools, and also underperformance in schools as well. This is why the CDC and the EPA have dictated there is no safe levels of lead exposure in children. Over and over and over again, this is what they say. It leads to these detrimental effects that are for life. So once you get these deficiencies, you have a very critical window to actually create these neural pathways, which is 5 years and under. If you aren't able to do this, you will have these deficiencies for the rest of your life. And I know the airport likes to talk about how it is an economic driver in the area. However, not much is talked about of how much of an economic deterrent this lead exposure is. Because of this lead exposure, and you have detriments in the human body from it, you actually can cost society quite a lot. So the passive and the active social costs are actually quite substantial. There was a study done in 2009 that looked at if you just increase the blood lead levels by 1 microgram per deciliter in a child, how much would that cost society? And that would cost society $769 per child per year. It also decreased the amount of high school graduation by roughly, on average, 23%. So they don't get as high-paying jobs. They're more likely to go into crime and cause all sorts of problems. So by lowering the blood lead levels of children, you are actually helping them. By increasing it, you're causing a tax on society for doing this. And this isn't talked about very much. You can go on to the next slide. But how much, I've talked about there's no safe levels, but how much is too much? If we want to quantify, because people always ask me, well, if we're going to bargain and we're going to say, okay, we're going to have some amount of exposure in children, how much is too much? And that is 2 micrograms per deciliter is usually the go-to. Below 1 microgram or so, that is kind of falls into the noise. It's not really quantifiable, the effects of lead. Now, and this is the lowest level that is measurable and quantifiable IQ deficiencies in children, which again, I repeat, is permanent. I can go to the next transition. And the problem with that is that if you're going to go out and test children, a lot of these tests aren't very sensitive. They actually don't come online and actually test for lead until about 2 micrograms per deciliter, meaning by the time you actually go out and test a child and find they have lead, it is too late. You can't go out and say, okay, well, I found they have 1 microgram, I'll go out and test again in a few months and see if it increases or not, and then we might, have some medical intervention. It's too late. Once you hit that 2 microgram per deciliter dead limit, it's too late. Next slide. There we go. This is why the doctors in Jefferson County, about 20 of them, I believe, signed a letter to Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport in 2022 asking to halt expansion until the Colorado Department of Public Health conducts a lead study on the airport. Since then, the airport, as far as I can tell, has ignored the letter, judging by the planned expansion and rapid expansion of the airport, with the 3-21 runway closure and the Innovation Park expansion as well. You can go on to the next slide. So now we talked about, are we being exposed? We talked about how much material is required to affect the body. Now let's talk about how quickly are these toxins actually taken into the body, and how quickly can we actually detoxify this? Now, the unfortunate thing is that your body does not have a good mechanism on how to actually detoxify the lead. This is you've heard of probably heavy metal poisoning. There's no good way to get rid of heavy metals in your system. You have to get medical intervention and get chelation. Now the question is, well, how quickly does it actually intake into your body? And this is where my background comes on in. So you can go to the next study. So there was a study done in 2012 and 2013 looking at how quickly nanoparticles are uptaken into the body via inhalation. And this is important if you think about it this way. If I were to take a 1 kilogram mass of lead and put it right in front of you, that would be alarming, but the CDC and the EPA would look at this and say, that's safe. You cannot eat it, you cannot ingest it, you cannot inhale it, you cannot inject it. Therefore, it is safe. If I start breaking this particle down into smaller chunks, well, at what point does it become more and more toxic? At some point, you'll be able to eat it, and at some point, you'll be able to breathe it in. In 2012 and 2013, a bunch of scientists got together and did a few studies, and they said, okay, at nanoparticles from 5 to 40 nanometers, so particles that are 100 times smaller than the human hair, how easily can they bypass the epithelial cells of the lung and get incorporated into the body? And they found out that nanoparticles 4 nanometers in diameter and higher were excluded, while 18 nanometers or smaller passed through and penetrated into the cells. And this is the exact same mechanism my advisor and I use to actually label and tag cells, because they are more readily penetrated into the cells and uptaken into the human body. So you go into the next slide. So Griffiths in 2020 set out and looked at the nature of lead emissions from piston engine aircrafts. You can go to, maybe click 2 more times. Perfect. He found that the particles being emitted that were 13 nanometers inside of lead dibromide core surrounded by hydrocarbons. I mentioned that they have a signature emission if you want to go and find definitive proof that these emissions are from aviation, and they're very simple tests. You actually can look for this lead dibromide. Of significant concern, though, is that these particles are very small. If you look in the bottom right, that's a histogram of particle sizes. Blue is aircrafts, and orange is from automobiles back in the day when they still had lead, tetraethyl lead in the fuel itself. You'll see the automobiles are, pretty much are larger compared to the aircraft exhaust, while all the aircraft exhaust is about 18 nanometers and smaller. Therefore, it really is far more toxic compared to emissions from gasoline cars. So it has a much higher toxicity rating, and and children are much more susceptible to this. Next slide. So we talked about how this is how we are exposed, how much we're exposed to it. We talked about how much is required to actually affect children, and we talked about how easily it is uptaken into the human body. But how do we connect it all together? How do we actually relate this to blood lead levels in children? Now, I chose a retail view study to present to you, but I could have chosen a plethora of other reports. This one just happened to be a tour de force that looked over many children over many years to show conclusively that there is a correlation to avgas fuel sales and operations at an airport to blood lead levels of children in the area. So to compare Reed Hillview Airport to Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport, Reed Hillview Airport peaked in 2018 at 180,000 operations per year, while Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport had over 262,000 operations per year last year. Similar to Rock Creek, there was no elevated lead levels in the soil, yet children nearby the airport still tested high for lead in their blood while living next to the airport in Reed Hillview Airport. And the bottom is just basically a news article that basically goes through exactly that. So if we go to the next slide, you can maybe click a few times. So I'm just going to go through some of the key findings of that Reed Hillview Airport, just kind of summarize it and ingest it down for you. Now, the big thing is, that is kind of known in the scientific community, is that lead-formulated aviation gasoline, or avgas, is a primary source of lead emissions in the United States today. They analyzed over 14,000 blood lead samples of children under the age of 5 residing nearby the airport in Santa Clara County. And they found that blood lead levels of sampled children increase and are higher among children who are predominantly downwind from the airport, increase with the volume of piston engine traffic and quantities of avgas sold at the airport. And the blood lead levels of airport proximate children are especially responsive to increase in piston engine traffic, which makes sense. You sell more fuel, you're going to expose more lead to the environment, which is going to be uptaken by children. In conclusion, in support of the scientific education of the EPA's recent announcement and endangerment finding, this in-depth case study indicates the deposition of avgas significantly elevates the blood lead levels of at-risk children. So there's a huge correlation between avgas fuel sales and blood lead levels in children. And it doesn't matter if the airport is only selling 1%, 10%, or 20% of their fuel sales are avgas, it's the quantity sold. All right, so next slide. So we talked about children proximate to the airport. And so the Reed Hillview study looks at a distance of 0 to 1.5 miles from the airport. So how far are your communities from that? So Countryside and Walnut Grove start about 3/4 of a mile away from the airport, and it ends about 1.72 miles from the airport. I threw Skystone on in. I know that that's actually not your jurisdiction. That's actually Broomfield, but maybe some people online are from Skystone and are interested in this. Their middle is about 1.36 miles from the airport. Go to the next slide. Green Knolls, which is in the airport critical zone, is about a little bit less than a mile from Green Knolls. And then places of interest, including Whitstone Elementary School and Stanley Lake High School, are 1.2 miles and 1.38 miles away, respectively. So they are within this bubble that Reed Hillview looked at. So go to the next slide. So the next thing that they said is that those who are downwind are going to be much more affected compared to those who are upwind. And so we can look at this picture on the left, which is called a wind rose plot, which is a tabulation of wind in the area from 1981 until 2022. And this shows that the predominant direction of the wind is from the west and from the north. And this is the reason why Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport has its runways angled as it does, because they want to take off with the wind as often as possible. However, unfortunately for you, this means that Countryside and Walnut Grove is directly downwind when the winds are coming from the north, and Green Knolls is basically always downwind with the northwest corridor right there. Also means that because you are downwind, your schools are going to be more affected as well, because you have your Witt Elementary School and you have your Stanley Lake High School all downwind from the airport. You also have Stanley Lake downwind at the airport. But for today, we'll just focus on the children. Next slide. So here's the good, the bad, and the ugly that really was summarized in the Reed Hillview Airport study. So they summarized it in they summarized the number of gallons sold by the airport with blood lead levels, predicted blood lead levels of children. Now the good news is I couldn't find any residences that are under half a mile away. I could be wrong. I'm not an expert of your area or your residence, so I might have missed somebody. But as far as I can tell, they're at least 3/4 of a mile away. Now the bad news is that still within that 0.5 to 1.5 miles, you do see increases in blood lead levels of the surrounding communities. Specifically, you can see that in red, I guess maybe purple on this screen, that as you went from 5,000 gallons of gasoline sold per month to 35,000 gallons of leaded gasoline per month, you can see it pushing up a little bit past 1.8. Now, the bad is that Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport, on average, sold 45,000 gallons per month. So it is off the chart by 30%. Even worse, children 2 months of age and lower saw an increase double of that, from an increase of to 0.32 micrograms per deciliter over the baseline. To put that in perspective, at the height of the Flint water crisis, child blood lead levels surged by an estimated 0.35 to 0.45 micrograms per deciliter over the baseline. So you have, unfortunately, a Flint water crisis here in Westminster. So I said that I was trying to help educate you and help inform you, and so what you decide to do from here is up to you. When I saw this data, and me being a married and moved to Rock Creek to start a family, my informed decision was, well, I can't have a child. It's not safe to have a child that's going to be permanently damaged by the emissions from this airport. So my wife and I had to make the unfortunate decision to put a family on hold until this was solved. Now, I consider myself one of the lucky ones because I don't have a child. But it's up to you to determine what you actually want to go through and do. And now I've grown a little bit older and a little bit wiser since I made the presentation to Superior, so I actually have a few suggestions, but it's up to you to determine how far you want to push it. I have it listed from those easily attainable to requiring a little bit of stubborn things and politicking to happening. So first, you can just hit a few transitions. I probably get till it gets to the bottom. The first thing I recommend is an education campaign to help mitigate and protect your citizens. This is done by a lot of by California for a lot of airports in the area that are trying to mitigate the effects of lead in their communities. So first thing I would recommend is that you tell everyone to ask your child's doctor about getting their blood tested for lead. Most insurance companies cover it for at-risk patients, and living next to an airport qualifies. Therefore, it allows them to make a decision of what's best for their family depending upon their risk tolerances. A few other things are keep your windows and doors closed as much as possible. And if you want to go the extra mile, supplement energy costs for low-income homes to offset air conditioning costs. Avoid eating fruits and vegetables from backyard gardens because this can cause another pathway of exposure through ingestion. Fruits and vegetables can not only be covered in lead exhaust, but they tend to absorb heavy metals, including lead, from the soil. This is the exact same reason why, if you live in Layden, you have to sign a disclosure that you would not plant root vegetables to pull the plutonium from the ground. Other things such as washing your child's hands often, especially before eating and sleeping. We can go to the next slide. You can probably hit a few. So we talked about the exposure often comes from this touch and go activities. So to help combat and help reduce the amount of touch and go activities at the airport, you can basically ask Jefferson County to institute a landing fee at Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport. This is something completely in their control, and it's a simple one-time fee that when wheels touch the ground, a small fee is added. It's used across many general aviation airports and can be instituted today. It would discourage the heavy touch and go traffic pattern over Westminster. Other aviation traffic that doesn't have this heavy traffic work that touch and go activity has over the airport wouldn't be affected, so the airport can still operate normally. Because most users would not be affected by this one-time fee. And wouldn't affect most users because it's such a high demand at Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport. Sure, some people might get annoyed and leave, but you have to remember Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport has a many-year-long waiting list to get a hangar and is in extreme high demand. And the airport director, Paul Anzo, said he would only institute landing fees if Jefferson County asked him to. I would also encourage you to follow up the letter in 2022 asking Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport to stop expansion until the Colorado Department of Public Health conducts a lead study. Currently, the airport is planning to expand the operations of the airport, creating new hangars and room for flight schools with a proposed Verve Innovation Park expansion. And the link in the bottom right, you can basically go to the Jefferson County AAB minutes where they talk about it. Adding more activity means adding more fuel exposure and more lead exposure in the surrounding communities. And it seems a little bit short-sighted to do so if there isn't a plan in place to help mitigate this lead exposure. Also contact the Colorado Department of Public Health due to a lead study. Help educate and test proximate children's blood. And then we get on to the harder things to do. There is actually a unleaded fuel already available. We can probably click a few times and just clicks to the, there we go, yep. So ask Rocky Mountain Metropolitan to offer unleaded fuel. 66% of all general aviation aircrafts can already use unleaded fuel if they get a supplementary type certificate from the FAA. They don't have to change their engine. All they have to do is go to the FAA and say, I want a certificate. It gets tested. They spend a little bit of money, $200 to $1,500 per aircraft, depending on horsepower. And flight schools can transition as well for about $10,000 to $15,000 for their entire fleet. However, this is a chicken and egg problem. No general aviation aircraft and no school is going to transition over unless it is offered at the airport. And currently, Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport is not considering offering unleaded fuel until about 2027 at the earliest. That's 3 years away. That is an entire generation of children who will be affected, who will have increased blood lead levels for the rest of their lives. Fentanyl Airport offered the unleaded fuel this summer, and they had the same time frame to do it. So with all the expansion happening at the airport, which is going to cost millions of dollars, it kind of makes me question, as a nearby resident, why can't they afford a little bit of money to offer these tanks? And finally, I would say contact Hickenlooper over the FAA Reauthorization Act wording of unleaded fuel. It would come at a very, very strong from a city council. You click 2 more times, I think. Great. The current Authorization Act makes it very, very difficult if it goes through to actually offer unleaded fuel. It stands to actually perpetuate the having leaded fuel around. It's making it much, much more difficult. And finally, when I gave this presentation, so I've gone over a lot of facts of exposure and kind of equated blood lead levels in the community. At the time when I was giving this presentation for Superior, we didn't really know how much of the community was actually being affected. No one had really known about it. Not a lot of people had gone out and gotten their blood lead levels tested. Unfortunately, since then, a lot of people have gotten tested, and they've kind of through the woodworks come back and talked to me about this. So for residents in your community, there was a resident in Green Knolls who went out and got tested, adults, 3.5 micrograms per deciliter. In Countryside, 1.75 micrograms per deciliter. Another in Green Knolls went out and initially got 1.0 micrograms per deciliter, came back a few months later and it went up to 1.7 micrograms per deciliter. And the worst of all came from Rock Creek, in my opinion, where a family moved in about 4 months ago and have a 3-month-old. So that child has been living in Rock Creek his entire life. They recently got it tested and came back with 3.5 micrograms per deciliter. Permanent effects for the rest of their life. Your community is already being affected, and I wish you the best of luck in trying to parse your way through this and find a way out. Thank you.
Please continue.
Oh, I'm to any questions now.
We have
Yes.
someone not feeling so well in the audience.
I know. I'm happy to pause if someone needs medical attention. So.
Okay. So a question about I know you tested the windowsills, and it makes sense to get blood level testing. I'm just curious, are there any filters, air filters that can actually block
That's a great
some of
question.
this?
That's a very good question. So, due to the nature of how small these particles are, it's actually very difficult, near impossible to find filters that actually filter out all these particles. When I found out that there was lead in the area, I ran out and got the best HEPA filter there was. It was Blue Air. They said the specs were down to about 100 nanometers. Unfortunately, 100 nanometers is the smallest it can filter out, and these particles are 18 nanometers and smaller, so they won't actually filter out the air. I know some pamphlets say, oh, you should probably get a HEPA filter because it will do something, but not much. The best way is elimination, unfortunately, to eliminate the lead exposure itself.
Oh, and I just had one other question on the, you had a map
Yep.
of, there were two maps. One was just like the.
The
kind
touch
of
and go
look-
traffic,
The
yep.
touch and go traffic, but I was trying to understand the one that had all of
Yes, so
the-
that's a great question. So that basically when I was creating this, thank you. So go to the next slide. One more, perfect. Oh, one more back. Perfect. So we looked. So the previous image looked at the touch and go traffic specifically over the area. And when I was creating this this presentation initially, this was not only shown at the town of Superior, but also ACES as well, which coordinates with Boulder County and with Superior for trying to find environmentally friendly things to do. So I brought this to attention, and I was showing them this traffic. This simply shows that the piston air traffic and where it's going. In this case, they are going north because there are a few training grounds up north and there are a few airports up north. So you can see to the left over there, you see that another loop. That's Boulder Airport where they go to train. To the right, you see another kind of loop in, with that orange box. That would be Erie Airport. There's another area to train. So some of these flights are going out or coming in for training. So that's the kind of the pathway and the corridor they go. I'm sure I've seen one of the CNR representatives there that he knows that there's a hot contention topic about direction of flights and things like that, but that's not the topic here. This was just to show flight patterns and where they're going. But I want to emphasize, though, even though they are going away, most of the emissions come during the takeoff section and the climb out section, which happen close to the airport. So once they get to the altitude, they actually pull back the throttle and they try to produce less noise, which also creates less emission. So, but most of it, though, comes during the takeoff section of these touch and go pattern works.
So ostensibly, that big black area is kind of where they've reached a greater height, and
Correct.
there's not as much
Correct.
exposure. This is
Correct.
only.
And that's the reason why you see less exposure further away from the airport compared to close to it. This is the same thing that was seen in the Reed Hillview Airport. Huge effects under half a mile from the airport. Starts going lower at 1.5 miles, and further than that, kind of gets into the noise, and they couldn't really quantify it. So that's why I focus on about 1.5 miles away from the airport.
Your graphic might be helped by maybe.
Shrinking it down,
That
yes.
area. Well, I mean, it's fine to show that, but.
Yeah.
The most impacted area.
Yeah, yeah.
Highlight.
So that was on the previous slide of the touch and go activity. Yep.
I have to thank you for the presentation. That was very thorough.
Try to be.
And it's one thing if you don't know about a hazard, but it's a completely different thing once you learn about it. So thank you so much for presenting it.
Of course. And if you have any questions later, you can always contact me. I'm happy to elaborate on stuff.
Yeah, thanks for that. It was it's certainly logical and compelling argument you make there. I have a question on CDPHE and the lead study.
Yep.
Are they planning to? Do we know if PHE is planning on actually doing that lead study?
I am not aware that they are, but maybe we can ask the county when they're up.
And so we had lunch with Congresswoman Pedersen, that same lunch that we talked about earlier, last Thursday, and we brought up the lead issue. She says she's working already with staff. Do you know what, and that she would give us an update on what they've been doing regarding that with the airport?
We have not received an update from her staff, but we have answered questions from her staff. So I think she's still in the fact-gathering kind of role, if you will. So
Okay.
don't have details on what she's been able to achieve yet.
Okay, thanks.
Airport 10.
I find this interesting. I've lived there my whole life. I went to Witt Elementary, which isn't a school anymore, so that might be interesting information if you give this presentation in the future. I'm curious and maybe you went through it and I missed it. There's a lot of data that you've thrown
Yes.
out at us. So what preempted you to go out and do this study? It sounds like you're in one of the affected areas where we hear a lot of
Correct.
noise and lead concern.
The increase in traffic. So back in 2014 or so, if you can go to the hidden slide, actually, that's a little bit 2 slides above. Do you see it? There's like a hidden slide. Back in 2014 or so. Perfect. So here are the total operations that happened over the years. And you can see for a good amount of time coming from 2008 to 2015, there was a lull in activity at the airport. So about averaging about 114 total operations per year on the far right side of the map. Now in about 2014 or so, there was an exponential increase in growth at the airport. And that prompted people to be like, well, what's going on? What's happening? Before then, I wasn't particularly around. I actually moved into my house in 2021. So I kind of came in the thick of it and thought, well, what's going on as well with this? I knew that the airport operations, according to our navigation easement in Rock Creek, which is a high contention.
So did you originally get interested because of sound or because of lead?
I got interested because of sound.
Okay. Because I mean, if you studied this, the airport was really busy once upon a time and went down and went back up.
Yep.
So I'm just interested from a data perspective. So take me, for example. My parents are original homeowners in Countryside. They still live in the same home. You know, many people who live in Countryside have like moved away, went to college, come back, live there. So I imagine, is there any kind of historical actual information that points? I mean, you've made some big assertions, such as this is a Flint, Michigan style emergency.
Yep.
That's a pretty tall statement, I'll be honest with you. So is there any historical data to prove that, considering there's people who have lived in that community there, such as myself, their entire life? Granted, I did drop out of school. It was mostly because kids were jerks and got my GED and went to college, but here I sit. So, I mean, I'm just trying to understand how far back some of this study went.
So for the rehabilitation study aspect, it did not go back that far. It only went back to about 2010. Okay. However, to go answer your question, going back that far, going back to original owners of the house, a lot of the data is conflated with fuel from combustion engines at the time, right? So combustion engines weren't fully phased out until 1996 or so. So there would be some lead from that. However, from an avgas perspective, there probably was very, very little impacts in the area. If you go back to actually the history of Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport, my understanding is that the southern runway wasn't used as often as the northern runway. And this was due to the fact that it didn't actually have a high enough payload to do this high traffic work. It wasn't until 2014 when the actual runway was reinforced that activity really took off and the complaints really skyrocketed. So a lot of people contribute this reinforcement of the southern runway to this increase in flight traffic over these communities. So it's kind of hard to determine and single out, okay, yes, there was a good amount of traffic at the airport, but no one really complained or talked about it because it's mainly using the northern runway. And that runway is a little bit further and those activities don't go directly over these communities in general. So it's a little bit harder to conflate that. Second, I point to the child who is only 3 months old, which has high levels of lead in their blood, or people who aren't original owners, who aren't around the area, who are testing for high levels of lead in their blood, who are moved into the community. You know, for example, the one in Countryside having 1 micrograms, Green Knolls, having 1 micrograms per deciliter, and then a few months later testing for 1.7 micrograms per deciliter. So clearly there is an effect on your community that is pushing these blood levels higher. It doesn't happen magically.
Well, I agree. I just don't know that it's conclusive. I mean, lead unfortunately comes from a lot of different places. Flint, Michigan wasn't from an airplane. And I mean, you brought that up as an example. So
correct, but do you have lead in your water? Where do you have lead in your soil?
My point is for the public. This council has taken this very seriously, and so you mentioned some things as far as what we've done. We've written some letters to our delegation. We've looked at things that are inside our control. We've asked you here to have this conversation because we do take the health and welfare of our community serious, but I also, want to put in context what we're hearing here tonight, because it sounds like an opinion mixed in with a lot of facts.
So then, can I take it one step further then? I talked about speciation of the lead emissions. So speciation of lead emissions says, okay, if you're going to have lead from one source from lead compared to lead from another source, you can actually differentiate where that lead is coming from. There are methods and techniques you can use to actually speciate the lead and show definitively that yes, it is coming from the airport.
And I appreciate that, and I guess that if we were to go down that path, I feel like an outside source who's not directly affected by this, quite frankly, would probably be the proper place. But I appreciate the information this evening. I think it's been very helpful and educational, and I appreciate your time.
Any other questions? Thank you so much for being with
course.
us.
Thank you.
And I have a request for us to take a break while we're changing presenters.
Okay, sounds good. Dr. Patel, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Well, and they had a couple spontaneous fires in the
Much salt for me.
from like the glove box.
That's right.
Okay, part two.
All right, Mayor, we're, as I said, this is part two of a discussion about RMMA. We're joined by representatives from the county, certainly Commissioner Crafthart, thank you for attending, County Manager Joe Kirby in the back.
Stephanie Corbo, Chief Financial
Chief Financial Officer, yep, I remember that. And then Airport Director Paul Ansel, who will lead the presentation this evening. Just before we begin, I did pass out the maps that Mayor Pro Tem sent out just before the meeting tonight. These are hard copies, just for your information. So, Mr. Ansel, go ahead.
Ready, next slide. Mayor, councilors, thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak about leaded fuel and the transition plan that Jefferson County Airport has. Next slide. Next slide. So I gave this presentation to the board and kind of some background, I think 8 or 9 months ago, but as a refresher for new people and for the people in the audience, Rocky Mountain Metro Airport was founded in 1960. It's owned and operated by Jefferson County, and in aviation terms, that's actually called the sponsor. So Jefferson County, you'll hear me respond to them as the sponsor. We are the third busiest airport in Colorado. We are officially a GA, which is General Aviation Reliever for Denver International Airport, which means if they have a problem at Denver, those planes are designated. They can come to our and Centennial to get those passengers out of the air. We have over 400 based aircraft and approximately 50 businesses that are based on the airport. And we do have a major economic impact to the community. CDOT Aeronautics in 2020, they do a study of all the airports in the state. And Rocky Mountain Metro Airport has a $730 million annual economic impact. That was 3 years ago. We believe we're well over $1 billion, and when the new one comes out in 2024, you're going to see we're probably $1.2, $1.5 billion in economic impact. Next slide. It's important to think about governance of the airport. So Jefferson County, as I said, is the sponsor. They hired me to run the airport, Rocky Mountain Metro Airport, and what I mainly do is property management. I manage all the leases. We have over 400 leases at the airport, and I'm also in charge of the airfield maintenance and operations. So we do our own plowing, and I maintain the ground. Jefferson County also has an airport advisory board that works with airport staff, but it also advises the county commissioners directly. We do that at least twice a year. That's scheduled in as when needed. Also, there is the Rocky Mountain Metro Community Noise Roundtable that we started up almost just over 2.5 years ago, that seeks a collaborative method to reduce noise impacts on the surrounding communities. The other part of that governance is the federal government, who uses the FAA, and they are in charge of air traffic control and airspace regulations. And that's really important because I don't have the authority to tell planes they can take off, they can't take off, they can't leave at 4 in the morning and come back at midnight. They can only do so many touches. I do not have the authority, much like you all do not have the authority to say, Larry's neighbor has a Harley who goes, driver who goes to work every morning at 4:30. He wants them to say, that's not allowed. You all don't have that authority, neither do I. The other thing that the FAA does is they give airport grants. So we've gotten over $100 million in FAA grants, and they basically help us maintain our primary runways and taxiways, and some other things. They bought some snow plows and some other things over the years, but that is how the airport is run. Next slide. Anytime Jefferson County, as the sponsor, gets a grant from the FAA, they sign a grant assurance, which is 39 rules that says if you take this money, these are the rules that you have to follow. Some of the most important ones are economic non-discrimination. So it says, we will make the airport available to all aviation enthusiasts, no matter what it is. I can't say, well, I really don't like that kind of plane. I don't want you coming in. And there's a very specific line in it that says, including commercial aeronautic activities. People get very nervous when we talk about commercial service, bringing in, Delta or Spirit or another. By the grant assurance and federal regulations, we are not allowed to discriminate. So if that did occur, the Jefferson County Commissioners can't say, well, we really don't want that. It's just going to cause too much headaches. That is part of those grant assurance that we take when we take that money. The other one is we were required to maintain a fee and rental structure for the facilities and services at the airport, which will make us self-sustaining. So we get no Jefferson County general fund money. We get no special, money from the county. We are self-sustaining other than the FAA grants, which again, mainly go to the runways, air traffic control tower was rebuilt, things like that. So that's how we operate at the airport. Next slide. So I'm here tonight, I was asked to come here about leaded aviation fuel and the transition of how we're gonna go from leaded aviation fuel, which has been used in aircraft since they started, to include even the last 40 years when they started phasing it out from automobiles, but there was no acceptable alternative for aviation planes, small piston engine planes. So that's what I'm here to talk about tonight. Next slide, please. Okay. Piston aviation aircraft, which is what you see in that picture, Cessna 172s, Piper Arrows, all those stuff, they use 100 low lead. So there's a low lead amount in there. And the reason they need that is they need that high octane, and the lead creates that high temperature, which keeps the power to the engine. Take away the lead, take away the power, now you have issues with the engines running smoothly. Approximately 10% of the fuel sold at Rocky Mountain Metro is 100 low lead. The rest is Jet A. Jet A is used in commercial aircraft, business jets, planes like that, most helicopters, and there is no lead in that fuel. The vast majority of the piston engine aircraft are certified, and that's an important point, to use 100 low lead. And what you see on the right is the far picture is actually a panel on the wing of an aircraft that says this is the only authorized fuel you can put in this aircraft. And then the little text above the picture of the plane is in your pilot handbook that says this is the only acceptable fuel that you can use. So there are aircraft out there that aren't able at this point, we'll talk about how we're going to get to that point, to use the new unleaded fuel that's just come out. Next slide, please. This is probably the most important thing I want to talk about tonight, and I want everyone in this room to realize Jefferson County and Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport does not sell any fuel, whether leaded or unleaded. We don't sell fuel. We have private businesses operating at the airfield selling a legal product, just like 7-Eleven sells cigarettes. We all know cigarettes are bad, but the cigarettes are legal and they sell them. We, as Jefferson County and the airport, don't sell any gas. Next slide, please. Okay, how do we transition away from that 100 low lead and actually get all those aircraft operating on the unleaded fuel that's just been coming out? So first and foremost, the refiners and the developers of the fuel have to come up with a safe alternative. That happened in 2023, to include last quarter of 2023. So this hasn't been around for 10 years and we're just dragging our feet. The safe fuel was recently approved by the FAA to use in these aircraft. Next thing is the FAA approval. So there's two types of fuels out there right now. There's Swift, which is 94 octane, and then there's GAMI, which is the 100 unleaded fuel. Those are the type of two fuels that are approved. The previous presenter talked about type certificates. To allow you to use those fuel, the owner, whether it's a flight school or a private plane owner, has to go and get that type certificate from the FAA, and it's basically aircraft are starting to go through that process. And again, it's somewhere between $200 and $1,500 between the number of engines and the horsepower. So a flight school that may have 25 aircraft could be $20,000 for them to get all their aircraft switched over to that fuel. Very significant cost for them. The other, really the big tent, the pole in the tent, is the supply and distribution network. It just came out in 2022 at the end of it, and that development is going on. The refineries are spooling up, but there's 19,000 airports in the country. We're all switching over to unleaded fuel about the same time. So that has to ramp up to meet the demand of all those airports at the same time. Finally, to do that, you can't mix current fuel with the new unleaded fuel. It's very similar to adding, if your wife went to and put diesel in your car or gas in your diesel engine, that will ruin the engine. On the road, all of a sudden you start getting some clinks and clanks in your engine, and you pull over to the side of the road and you call AAA. In the air, that creates an issue where that plane's coming down out of the sky. So we have to do it safely. To do that, the FBOs, mostly for safety, but also some liability, have to buy a whole separate ecosystem for that unleaded fuel. So they need tanks to store it in. They need trucks to transport it in so that you're not mixing fuel, which then goes into an aircraft, which then calls that aircraft down. So again, we're 8 months into this and we're making fast progress, but it is a big leap to get our airport and the other 19,000 airports across the country to this. The previous presenter mentioned Centennial Airport. Centennial Airport had $4 million that they had saved up and they were going to upgrade their air traffic control tower. At the last minute, the FAA says, hey, we've got excess funds. We're going to give you $4 million for that. They then said, great, we now have our air traffic control tower taken care of. What do we do with this $4 million? They went and they had a spare tank and a spare truck, because they have 4 FBOs, we have 2. And they went and paid for the transition, because you have to steam clean them and sterilize them and get the trucks and the tanks ready. And they started buying unleaded fuel, and they're starting to offer that. Every airport in the country, much like every city in the country, has different financial situations. We don't have that $4 million laying around where we can just go and say, hey, let's get a truck and a trailer. That cost is somewhere in the $2 million range. And then they're supplementing the STCs. They're also supplementing the cost of the fuel. The unleaded fuel is anywhere from $1 to $4 more a gallon, depending on how large of a load you get delivered from the distributor. So they're using that $4 million. And at the end of this year, they're going to have to look at their budget and say, well, we have money left over, and is that the best way to spend it? So it's a great thing that they did. I think every airport in the country, if they had $4 million, would do very similar things. But it's not a fair analysis to say, well, they did it, why haven't you? Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to talk about the specific types of fuel that were approved by the FAA. The first one is, the company's name is Swift. They created a 94 octane unleaded fuel. It is approved through a supplemental type certificate as a drop-in replacement for 66% of the aircraft out there. So 2/3 of the aircraft are able to use it if they get that certificate. 1/3 are not. It will destroy those engines and bring those aircraft out. That's important to note, because if you put the wrong fuel in, we're going to have issues. So that STC requires only the installation of a placard and the pilot handbook supplement. Swift UL was implemented at Centennial this summer by one of their 3. They actually have 4 FBOs, and they had extra tanks. So they are currently working on a 100 low lead unleaded octane to replace the 94, because they know that 94 doesn't work in all the aircraft, and they're not 100% sure that it works great at altitude. So at sea level, it's a pretty good fuel. We're still figuring out over trial and error, and you don't really want to do things in trial and error in aviation if it's a great fuel. That 100 unleaded should be ready by 2025. Next slide. GAMI is the other main fuel developer, and as these 2 fuels come online, we've talked to a bunch of fuel companies and fuel distributors. Everybody sees that this is the market to be in, and we think that's going to accelerate very quickly from 2 manufacturers to probably 20 or more as we do this switch. But GAMI has a 100 unleaded approved fuel as a drop-in replacement, and it fits in all aircraft, and that's a very important point. And that was basically approved in September of last year. It requires the installation of a placard in the pilot handbook. GAMI has partnered with AvFuel, which is a distributor, to oversee the logistics and production of distribution to try to speed it up. But any supplier of the GAMI 100 will receive non-discriminatory pricing and access, which is required by the FAA. That 100 unleaded will appear more widely in the market in 2024. So you think about what's going on with Swift, there are 100 low lead in 2025, or the GAMI looks like it'll be coming to the market in 2024. We're going to have 2 choices of what the airport does and which fuel we go with. Next slide, please. Okay, so the Swift is available now. It requires that STC. It's approved for 66% of the piston aviation fleet. And it creates, and this is there's a couple points I really want to make. There is a risk of unimproved fuel being placed into higher compression engines. And here's an example. One of my flight schools, at 11 o'clock at night, the fueler comes out and tops off every one of his single aircraft. If you put 2 Cessna 172s next to each other, and you're talking about an 18 or 19-year-old fueler, he's going to go down the line and he's going to fill those things up.
those aircraft could absolutely not be compatible with the engine. It's like if you buy a car that's got a 4-cylinder, but you want to get an upgrade to the 6-cylinder. The 6-cylinder won't take it and will run off the side of the road, and the 4-cylinder will. So there is a risk of going with the 94 of misfueling aircraft. So from the airport's perspective, which we always think in aviation safety first, we want to go with the safe method of going straight to the 100. So we'll use Swift or we'll use GAMI, whichever comes out first. But that's our point. We're going to bypass the Swift 94 because of the risk. We also think that the infrastructure costs of setting thing up for the 94 and then a year or maybe a year and a half later, we have to do all that again, detransition the fuel, permanently sterilize and do all the things to do it. Just doesn't make financial sense. And we think the 94 is a Band-Aid. It's not a strategic. It's not a long-term thought-out process. And the timeline, we believe, is about the same. For the GAMI 100, we're still 2 to 3 years out for distribution. Still requires the STC. It's approved for all aircraft that use that type of fuel. And you can completely replace the 100 low lead in all piston aircraft and eliminates that risk of misfueling. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned earlier, Jefferson County and Rocky Mountain Airport, we don't sell fuel, we don't own tanks, we don't own fuel trucks. Those are done by fixed base operators. Those are basically service stations for aircraft. So both of our fixed base operators on the field maintain fuel trucks and fuel tanks for 100 low lead. The unleaded fuel will require the installation of new tanks and the purchase of new unleaded trucks or the conversion of existing equipment. Again, you can't mix that fuel around. We are working to secure FAA grant funding to purchase both tanks and trucks so that we could basically be available to start servicing that fuel when it becomes available in a year to 2 years. Again, that's somewhere between, with inflation it's hard to say, but somewhere between $2 and $4 million that we're trying to get to be able to support that unleaded fuel. It takes time and money. The other thing we're doing is we are working with all the airports, the two FBOs, to get those trucks available. We're actually looking all around the nation right now because of the timeline to purchase a truck, to get it delivered. It's not like you go to a fuel truck dealer and you go, I like this one with the AC and the power windows. You have to order it, and the timeline is extremely far out there. And the cost of those trucks for these small trucks, $140,000, and those trucks are that $4 a gallon difference. The big 10,000 gallon trucks, that's where you get, you buy more fuel from the distributor, the price comes down. So we really want to buy bigger trucks and work with the FAA to get grants for those trucks and work with the FBOs so that we can get the cost down, because none of us in this room would pay $4 more a gallon in their own personal vehicle if that's what it costs. Now, if it's 50 cents and you're doing something good for the environment, then I think it's good, maybe even $1. But we have to get it down to where it's reasonable for the consumer. Next slide, please. Okay, our fleet there at Rocky Mountain Metro, we have over 400 aircraft. 103 to 106, somewhere around there, are actual flight school aircraft. The FAA requires that owner to apply for the STC. Those, as I mentioned earlier, are somewhere between $200 and $1,500 per aircraft. So an aircraft flight school would be between $10,000 and $15,000 for their entire fleet. And we're working with those flight schools to offset the cost. So we'll give rent credit to every personal pilot if he buys his own, to include the flight schools if they do the whole $20,000 to get their whole thing. We'll give them rent credits to offset the cost, so they're not paying that, the airport is taking that. So we're taking that on our own. Next slide, please. Next question. Or any questions? I get lots of questions, so.
So is something done mechanically to the engines to get this STC certificate?
No. It is a
So it's
paperwork
just a
drill with the
paperwork
FAA.
drill.
Correct.
Ready, answer? Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. It is
Okay.
just a paperwork drill where you have to apply for it, turn in the paperwork, and then the FAA approves it and gives you the placard and the pilot handbook inserts, which then you mount on your aircraft.
Gotcha. Okay, and then, so does that mean that during this transition period, you can have an airplane at one airport and he's using the 100 low lead, and he flies to a different airport, and they only sell 100 unleaded, he can't fill up there?
That's true. And what happened in Reed Hillview, which the previous presenter mentioned, they banned the sale of leaded fuel. A pilot went in there, realized that they only had the 94. They didn't have the 100, because the 100 you could use. It goes back and forth. It's the 94 that's not for every plane. He's like, I can't put that in my plane. He took off, ran out of fuel trying to go to another airport and crashed. So the FAA is investigating that. And one of the things we're very concerned about is doing this very safely. To include, if we were to sell the 94 and that plane was to go out to Kansas, because there's all kinds of steps during flight training. You've got your local procedures, you've got working with the tower, you've got touch and goes. Then you've got cross countries where you're required to go out, at least so many miles, go to a different airport, sometimes spend the night, come back. Our flight schools are very concerned about flying out to somewhere in Kansas, landing at an airport, and that plane cannot come back because they don't have the fuel available.
Right, but of course, the sort of Kafka-esque reality is that they could put that fuel in their plane, they just don't have the paperwork to validate it, and then if there was a problem, there'd be all kinds of legal consequences.
Yeah, but when you're talking about aviation, you don't just put fuel or the wrong fuel in a plane. You're risking your life, people's life on the ground, your passenger's life. That's not something anyone's going to do.
Well,
It's
if
not
it was
just
an
paperwork,
emergency,
right? There
you
is
do
a
it,
real.
but
No, let me
there's
finish,
never an
Bruce.
emergency.
No, let me finish, please. There is a real risk of putting the wrong fuel, as I mentioned. It's like putting diesel in your car engine or, gas into your diesel engine in your car. There's a real risk of those engines getting destroyed in air and coming down. And that plane that ran out of gas is the other thing. If you go, I can't put that fuel because I don't know what it's going to do to my engine. Now I crash because I don't have enough fuel. There is a real risk to that. It's not just you just don't have a piece of paperwork, you do it. The FAA, much like the medical field, is extremely regulated. We don't just go, I really don't want to follow that rule. I'd like to just take this fuel and go do this, and maybe I won't follow that rule. It's very regulated, and the vast majority of pilots, the vast majority of mechanics and shops and everything all follow the rules.
But there's nothing they do to the engine to change the engine.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Octane rating is based on the hydrocarbon components and then what other fuels are mixed with it. One of the reasons we use ethanol in our gasoline for our cars is that it raises the octane, correct?
I'm not a gas expert, so I don't know.
So you don't know what they do with the GAMI fuel and the other fuel to make it 100 octane?
No, I don't.
Thank you.
Do you?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I know what they do with car gasoline, and they can use other additives. I mean, that's all the tetraethyl lead does, is it raises the octane burning. To make higher octane fuel, you have to use more hydrocarbons of a certain chain length and stuff like that, okay? In really World War II, our airplanes were really designed to burn 100 octane fuel, but almost all of the practice flights we did, we were using a lesser quality fuel so we could maintain the 100 octane fuel for all of the overseas really aviation where they needed that power. Because when you take off, you're absolutely correct. You want full power to those engines.
Councilor Miller?
So you mentioned that essentially, is the whole industry, are all airports switching over to unleaded?
Yes. So the FAA, through their EAGLE program, the elimination of avgas lead emissions, has set a goal, and right now it's a goal, of eliminating all leaded fuel by 2030. We believe we'll be several years ahead of that. And as the industry comes along, just recently with the two fuels, it's been 40 years, no fuel has been approved to replace the current 100 low lead. Those two fuels just came on in 2023. So the whole industry, all the airports, we're all for the transition away from the leaded fuel onto the unleaded fuel.
And do you have the, so just so I understand, you don't sell the fuel, but you're having to purchase the equipment for the change in fuel?
We don't have to, but because the FAA can give us grants and not private businesses, we're working with the FAA and we're trying to get grants, and I think we're gonna get approved for those grants to purchase fuel tanks. Again, there's a lot of rules and regulations that follow that, but I can't then just turn a fuel tank that the FAA bought over to a private business. I will have to lease that tank. Same thing with the trucks. Tuesday, the FAA came out and said, we're not gonna buy trucks. They thought they were going to, headquarters and their lawyers, and said, we can't buy trucks, we can do tanks. So, and that's why the airport is going out looking for fuel trucks, because if we don't get one soon, the demand on fuel trucks is gonna go through the roof, and it may be, years before we can get one. So, we were hoping to get a grant for both. But again, we're looking to purchase those fuel trucks to basically lease them to the FBOs, because the FBO is a private business. They're like, I'm not required to do this. I probably won't until it becomes, financially viable. And so for us to be able to give those two businesses that infrastructure will speed up the process.
Okay, and then you're right now able to require what type of fuel is sold at the?
So we sell, again, we don't sell, but the two FBOs sell Jet A, which is in your commercial jet. See those pictures on the thing? All those planes, I believe, look like they fly Jet A, except for the small Cessna there. That's non-leaded, it's jet fuel. The other that is sold is 100 low lead. That's for the small training aircraft.
But as an airport, you can dictate what type of fuel is
No.
sold?
We cannot. It's forbidden by the FAA.
So basically everything that you're doing, which I appreciate the proactiveness of one, trying to get the fuel tanks and trucks early, as well as assisting with the flight schools, which you have a lot of.
We don't have a lot of. We
Being
have-
able to
we
make
have
the
4.
transition. So are you just essentially limited to incentivizing through providing the infrastructure, so to speak, and the transition to unleaded, but these FBOs could still sell leaded fuel?
There's a lot of questions there, but I'll try to break them down individually. So the answer is the FBO, we are trying to incentivize because we think that's the best way to move it forward quickly. Businesses will do it for profit, and they'll do it when the time is right. We think we can incentivize and make that transition go faster. The FAA prohibits us, and we think the reauthorization bill will actually prohibit banning the sale, it's still in process, the sale of leaded fuel until 2030, when the EAGLE program says, and the FAA says, that's when you have to get rid of it. We're trying to do that because we think that's the best way. There are I could probably go out and just say, hey, I'm gonna buy a fuel truck, and I'm gonna, but we don't have that much money. So we have to do things within our budget. So besides the infrastructure, we could also maybe facilitate paying the difference in the fuel between the leaded and the unleaded. So, if it's $2 more, maybe I pay $1.50 of it. The problem is, it's budget, right? We don't have the budget to be able to do that. So our best avenue is to work through the federal government. They buy the tanks, which again, if you think about a $2 million grant, that takes care of the tanks. I can afford, although my CFO would probably disagree, I can afford to buy 2 trucks at, $500,000. So that's where we get, because again, remember, the FAA just came out this week and said, we can't buy the trucks. There's too much liability and other things. So we'll pay for the tanks. We're gonna give you guys BIL money, infrastructure money, and you can use that money to buy the tanks, but you're gonna have to do. So my staff is currently looking, and they're very expensive. And it's also, do you buy the small truck and then have the user pay $4 more a gallon? Or do I spend double and get a big truck and have the user spend $1? So we're going through that exercise right now of trying to find what those options are and what makes the most sense for our budget.
Okay,
But also remember, and you're the landlord, so you're thinking exactly how you should be thinking. As an FBO, they will sell gas to what the planes that are coming in need. So it's a period of transition. This is brand new. There's not planes coming into the airport saying, we want unleaded gas. So that whole transition needs to happen. And we want to help the FBOs so that they are ready for that process.
Yeah, that was actually my next
Yes.
question was just, this is market driven essentially by consumers, not because you can't force the
Right.
consumers nor the FBOs to.
So we're gonna help
Buy or
them. We
provide
are
it.
incentivizing them. We are helping to move them in this process. Barriers that they will have. These are barriers that they will have. They will not be able to afford trucks. They will not be able to afford tanks. We want them to spend their resources on gas to be able to help as these planes transition. We're gonna help them smoothen that process. Yes?
Very well.
You're essentially trying to do everything you're possibly able to do to make it happen
That'd be correct.
because you don't have any way to require.
There's no way to require, that's correct, ma'am.
Thank you.
Before Mr. Baker's, or Counselor Baker speaks again, anybody, Counselor Azadi?
Yeah, thanks for this presentation. It too was also a logical, compelling argument you're making here. The infrastructure, supply, distribution, that makes sense. You're setting it up, you're incentivizing. The question I have is all the other ones. You said there's 19,000 airports switching. How many of them are going through this same process where they're trying to incentivize their...
That's almost impossible to, that would be saying how many cities are going through and having pothole trouble. I mean, that's
I don't need
impossible
specific
to know.
numbers. Give me some flavor
When we
as to
go
what
to
the...
conferences, when I go to talk to my fellow airport directors, especially the ones our size that have the financial capability, all of us are looking at doing the incentivization and doing the different things that we can do. There's a lot of small rural airports that are just not going to be able to do it for years and years and years until basically the FAA comes in and mandates it through using the EPA, and the FAA. So we want to be on the front. We want to be on the leading edge of that. But 19,000 airports, we're all going to have to go through the process.
The Swift 94, when was that approved?
Sometime in 2023, I believe.
Oh, this year, 94 was...
Oh, sorry, 2022. I apologize.
Okay. And GAMI, you said is...
September of 2022.
So you heard the previous presentation. What are your thoughts of the source of lead issue? So you've given us what you're planning to do to mitigate and to help these folks transition, but I'm curious what your personal thoughts are on what they talked about. Do you think the airport is a source of lead? Is the source of lead that as much as
So I would say
it is?
that I'm not a scientist. I don't work for the EPA. I don't work for public health. Public health has said there is no elevated lead around regional airports, to include our own county. I didn't say that. She said it. But I'm not a scientist. I'm an expert in aviation. I'm an expert at running airports. And so my job is to transition as quickly and as efficiently as we can and let public health. So I would say invite the director of public health here, invite the EPA, invite the FAA, but that's not my area of expertise, so I really don't have an opinion on it.
Okay, thanks.
Mayor Pro Tem?
I just wanted to make a point as far as like infrastructure. I don't see this as any different as different risks, different aircraft or transportation, but I mean, we're having the same conversation around electric versus gas. I mean, it's the same thing that happened when they transitioned away from leaded fuels. You got to think about how that impacts the people who uses transportation. And my understanding of the airport and the people that are getting trained, in previous presentations that you gave us, you talked about the shortage in airline pilots. That's something that's going to affect all of us if there's not these kind of schools around. And I know it's difficult, and there's noise, and there's lead, and all these different things. So I appreciate the fact that you're being proactive and finding ways to incentivize them to move along faster, because obviously there's the market component of it, which won't necessarily change the owners of the planes, because they may very well just not be able to afford 200 or 1,500 or whatever it is. But on that portion of it, so like once the FBOs go, is there any grants or thoughts or anything from the FAA to help some of those airline pilots, or is that really not, we're not there where they've started getting granular to that level?
So the FAA, through the rules, can't help private businesses, private individuals, private citizens. Their basic job is to fund airports to grow the national airspace and the use of that national airspace. So I would never say never, because governments and rules change, but as of now and as the history of the FAA, that is not something they could do.
Maybe we could bring that up with our federal delegation. I mean, the federal government likes to give money away for electric cars. Maybe they could do something in aviation that makes sense. So I know that's above your pay grade, but just a thought. But I appreciate you being here again. I know this is actually second or third time we've seen you in a short period, so I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Councilor Baker?
Yes, would another person characterize what you're describing as incentives for these private businesses? Would they characterize as subsidies for these private businesses?
And we go into politics.
I'm sorry, I don't care what someone else calls it. We're subsidizing, we're incentivizing it. To me, it doesn't matter. We're trying to get a job done in the most efficient manner that we can. And the terminology that used doesn't matter to me as an airport director. I'm trying to make this transition as quickly and as efficiently as I can.
And private business, when they generally use up a capital item, like a truck or a tank, they have like a depreciation period to it. And isn't that how they really recoup the money they use to replace the capital good?
Again, I'm an aviation expert. I'm an expert
you.
at running airports. I'm not an expert in, how FBOs classify their equipment and de-incentivize. This is not my area of expertise. And I don't care, because my job is to run this airport in the best way I can. And right now, my top priority is being on the forefront of that transition to unleaded fuel.
Councilor Rosati?
Can I ask my same question to Commissioner Tharp, your public policy?
Craft Clark, thank you.
Sorry, Kraft Tharp. What are your thoughts of the previous presentation, source of lead, from a public standpoint?
I'm not a scientist. I'm an attorney, and I'm a social worker, and I'm a policymaker. I'm not a scientist.
I would like to add one other thing. I've never seen those results. We've never been offered to even look at those tests so that we could evaluate them. Not that I'm a scientist anyway, but we hear all these studies. We've never been offered to actually take a look at those studies.
That's fair. I'm just curious. I just want to know what people think.
We've heard the concerns from the community, we've heard the concerns from different sources, and we're acting on it. And that's the message that we're telling you. So how we feel about the presentation, doesn't matter. We've heard concerns, and whether the lead is coming from the planes or whether it's coming from, whatever else, it doesn't matter. We're acting on it. We are being responsive to the concerns. When you met with the Congresswoman, did she talk to you about the FAA reauthorization?
Mm-hmm.
And what did she say?
That there's an amendment that they're working on.
But the FAA reauthorization right now, in the House, mandates the sale of leaded gas through 2030. So the FAA is our boss. The EPA is our boss. That's who we are listening to. That's who has authority over a lot of what we do. So I would encourage you to meet with the Congresswoman.
Anyone else? Anything from staff? Any questions? Thank you so much for coming again.
You're welcome, Mayor.
Being our second presentation on this, and just being open with us and letting us know what you're doing.
We have in the past invited you all for a tour, and some of you have taken us up on it, others of you have not. We would like to invite you again. It makes a difference. It makes a difference to actually be on the ground, look and see what's happening, hear the stories, hear the history, hear what we're doing, and we'd like to invite you again to come out for a tour.
I don't disagree. But can it be off work hours? I can't get all the way up here from Greenwood Village for a tour during 8 to 5.
We could do one special for you, ma'am.
I can join the special one.
You could fly, up from Centennial.
And that is very true.
You're close. You have a helicopter.
As Commissioner Kraft-Tharp said, I think those tours are eye-opening for a lot of people. So if there is an issue with work hours, it's a little bit hard now, days are getting shorter. It's hard to, drive around at night, but if you want to come in the next couple of weeks when we have time, I would absolutely do one after hours for the entire staff. We want to be good neighbors, we want you guys to understand what we're doing at the airport.
Again, thank you for your time tonight. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you. And I admire you all, that you're still at 9:36.
One more presentation.
I know.
Thank you.
Break or drive on?
Okay, I've just asked,
Bringing her down.
I've asked, Carmen
Are
and,
these different, David? Am I supposed to, is this like spot the difference?
yeah, they are.
So Mayor Pro Tem and councilors, this next agenda item is all about the annual audit, now called the ACFR.
No, there were two. I said I didn't need a map. I don't need a map.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah, that one comes out a little bit further. Oh, yeah, because so they have like.
Hey, guys, we got a meeting.
Rock and roll.
No, we're reviewing our
We're doing
data.
our highlights, spot the difference.
We've moved on.
Just waiting for y'all.
Figure out what this is.
Okay.
So what we'll do now is we'll transition to our third agenda item of the evening, which is about the annual audit. And I'll pitch it to Chief Financial Officer and Deputy City Manager Dorr to make some introductory comments, and then we'll hear from the team that did the audit.
Thank you, Mr. Freitag. Once again, Larry Dorr, Deputy City Manager, CFO, and wearing my Finance Director hat tonight. And you should have our annual comprehensive financial report for 2022 in your packets. It's also available online, of course. You should also have the audit report as well as our agenda memo that sets forth some information and statistics relevant to the annual comprehensive financial report. This audit was undertaken in accordance with the Westminster City Charter that requires an annual audit by an independent CPA firm. And so with that, I'll just turn it over to Sherry Sanchez, who'll have some opening remarks. Sherry, next week is marking her 28th year of service to Westminster. So thank you, Sherry, for your service, and congratulations for that. Also, some members of Sherry's staff from the Finance Department are here as well. And so with that, Sherry, I'll turn it over to you to introduce our guest, and we'll present the report.
Okay, well, great. Good evening, and Mayor and members of the City Council. My name is Sherry Sanchez. I'm the Accounting Division Manager for the city. And as Larry mentioned, our city charter, section 9.10, requires that our independent audit, we have an independent audit of our annual report, at least annually, in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, and conducted by certified public accountants experienced in municipal auditing, selected by the City Council. So the City Council awarded a contract for independent professional auditing services for the city's annual financial audit to BKD LLP, which is now Forvis LLP, for auditing services for 2020, with the option to renew for 4 additional one-year terms. The 2022 annual financial audit is the third of these one-year terms. I'm pleased to inform the City Council that the 2022 audit has concluded and that Forvis has issued an unmodified opinion or clean audit opinion of the city's 2022 annual comprehensive financial report. The annual comprehensive financial report is posted on the city's website under Financial Reports on the Transparency page. The financial statement audit provides users of financial statements with reasonable assurance that they can rely upon those statements to make informed decisions. The audit is an assessment of the fair presentation of the city's financial statements. It is not an assessment of the city's policies, strategies, or economic conditions. The auditor obtains reasonable assurance as to the fair presentation through audit testing, and the goal for the financial statements is to be free of material misstatements or otherwise errors and omissions that would be of significance and would have the potential for swaying or influencing the decisions of the end user. So you've been provided with physical copies of the annual comprehensive financial report for your reference in addition to the electronic attachment to tonight's staff report. And the report presented to you tonight is the result of a team effort. Team members, a couple who are with us today representing, and please raise your hand when you hear your name on my team back there. But team members include Business Operations Administrator Vicki Adams, Business Operations Analyst Yuki Wu, Accountants Don Cartier, Sherry Duran, Chris Martin, Gary Newcomb, and Lori Stevens, Retirement Administrator Kim McDaniel, Senior Financial Analyst Chad Smith and Sherry Young, Senior Contracts and Grants Coordinator Mary Jockwish, Accounting Specialist Valerie Dennis, and Finance Specialist Nina Vu. Additionally, Sales Tax Division Manager Deanna Cervantes, Treasury Division Manager Bob Beyerhoff, and of course Deputy City Manager, Chief Financial Officer Larry Dorr also contributed to the audit project. So the city's financials are vast and complex, and in addition to the financial statements and notes to the financial statements, I'd like to suggest the letter of transmittal and management's discussion and analysis at the front of the document for an overview of this year's financial highlights and summary information. So with that, now a little bit about Forvis. Forvis is ranked among the top 10 public accounting firms in the country. It was formed in 2022 through the combination of two nearly 100-year-old firms, BKD LLP and Dixon Hughes Goodman LLP. Forvis serves roughly 650 city, county, and state governmental clients nationwide. Forvis's assistance and professional approach contributed to a thorough and smooth audit this year. Forvis Audit Director and Certified Public Accountant Carmen Jeffries led the city's 2022 annual financial audit and joins us tonight to present to you the results of the audit. So please help me welcome Carmen.
Thank you very much. So first, good evening to all of you all, and thank you for the opportunity to come and present the fiscal year 2022 audit. Before I go any further, I really have to give kudos to Sherry and her team, because without them, we can't get the audit done. And so they were very diligent in providing us with the information that we requested and answering all of our questions. So I have to say thank you because that makes my job a whole lot easier. So wanted to make you guys aware of that. So now, you guys have been presented or provided the results of the our required communication in your packet. I will go over the highlights of this required communication and tell you what I'm required to tell you, seeing that it is getting late in the evening. So I don't want to forego, but definitely want to make sure that you guys have the ability to ask any questions that you like, and I'll be able to provide you with the information. So we will start. The scope of our audit to your financial statements and supplementary information was as of and for the year ended December 31st of 2022. We conducted that audit in accordance with our contract that was dated on January 17th of 2023. We are responsible, Forvis, for forming an opinion and expressing an opinion about whether the financial statements that have been prepared by management with your oversight are prepared in accordance with accounting principles generally accepted in the United States of America. As Sherry stated, we obtain reasonable rather than absolute assurance about the financial statements, i.e. we don't look at every transaction. We test on a scope basis and look there for reasonableness and to ensure that the financial statements are materially correct. We are independent. Our audit does not relieve management and those charged with governments of their responsibilities and related to the financial statements and the information that is presented. Additionally, we provided reports on the internal control over financial reporting and on compliance with other matters based on the audit of the financial statements performed in accordance with GAGAS, Generally Accepted Government Auditing Standards. In that, we review internal control, but that is not the basis of our test. If there's something that we find, we will definitely make you guys aware of it, but we do not perform our test or create them with the intention of looking for internal control deficiencies. So in addition to that, we also had a compliance audit and issued an opinion on the compliance for each major federal award program, which is also noted in your ACFR. The report on internal control over compliance, as well as the schedule of expenditures of federal awards. That is in accordance with OMB uniform guidance, and there too, we obtain a reasonable, not absolute assurance about those, about whether you guys are compliant with the required compliance supplement statements that you have to be compliant with for each federal program. In addition to that, we make note that we have read the ACFR for consistency purposes. We have not audited every single piece in the ACFR, but we have read it to make sure that it is consistent throughout the entire document, and that is our responsibility. So, moving on to our qualitative aspects of the our audit. Want to make you guys aware that we review significant accounting policies for reasonableness. We look at new accounting standards, and this year we had GASB Statement 87 leases, which we'll talk about a little bit later, which was an enormously heavy lift for the finance department, analyzing leases on top of leases on top of leases. And so we were able to get that done and the financials issued on time. In addition, we want to make note that there were no matters to report regarding unusual policies or methods or any alternative accounting treatments. Okay. Within your packet on page 4, if you're kind of following along, there are management's judgments and accounting estimates. We review what is listed here and have deemed these to be ones that are significant. We only review for reasonableness, so we're not trying to assess whether it was necessarily the premise behind it was right or wrong. It's really just for reasonableness to make sure that it is being shown that way. We also review financial statement disclosures, which we deem significant, and those this year were subsequent events and then the implementation of GASB 87, which we will talk about in just a minute. We talked about leases starting last year, I think, is when our conversation began. And so it just went throughout the entire year, and it possibly started before then. But we had a lot of conversation about that. Just so you'll know, not sure if you do, but GASB 87 leases basically placed the lessor and lessee right to use asset and liability on the face of the financial statements. So now, previously you had operating leases and capital leases, and those were shown in the footnotes. They are no longer in the footnotes. They are now on the face of the financial statements. And there is a very comprehensive footnote about 87 and what is required to be presented. But now you have a right to use asset and an associated liability with that, and you will be amortizing that over the life of that particular asset. We are required to provide you or let you know if there are any proposed and recorded adjustments, and there were none that we need to report this year. However, there were 2 unrecorded misstatements. However, those unrecorded misstatements do not, we didn't deem those to be material, and so they don't misstate the financial statements in any way. So we deemed that fine for them to be passed. We had no disagreements with management, at least not that I know of anyway. And so, as I've stated, we talked about GASB 87 throughout the entire audit and previously. In your packet, you also were provided with the management representation as well as the past audit adjustments. They are at the back. I won't go into detail on those unless there are questions. In addition, want to make you aware that we did have oral communications with management about things we saw that we felt like were best practices, things that would make the city better, more efficient in their work. So we have those conversations throughout just to provide value from that standpoint, because we want to continue to make you guys better as our clients and just as general people. Future accounting pronouncements that are huge this year. Just as we had GASB 87 last year, this year we have GASB 96. GASB 96 is where we look at subscription-based information technology arrangements. Yes, I said that very, very slow. Because that is basically the subscription part of what leases was. So now those subscriptions will be on the face of the financial statements once we deem those, whether they are material or not, based on the city's assessment. Additionally, GASB Statement 100, accounting changes for error correction, that will be in a couple of years, but that statement is basically changing the disclosures for error corrections and addressing some other issues that were found in previous GASBs. So that is the presentation. So I am definitely open to any questions, comments, concerns. But definitely want to say thank you to you all for giving us the opportunity. We love working with you guys, and so we are hoping to continue that relationship as we continue on.
Questions?
So thank you.
Questions going.
Is there another part of the presentation? Because that was just Forbes's part, right?
That's the entire presentation.
What would you like to discuss?
Yeah, I think there's some great high points in here, aren't there? Haven't we significantly increased our net position in both our business activity and our governmental activity?
You have. Can I see the?
I mean, the way I read it on page 5, net position as of December 31st, in our government activity from the year ending 2021 to the year ending 2022, we increased our position or net worth by $23 million.
Which is phenomenal.
That's great.
That is phenomenal.
And in our business thing, we increased our net position there by, 36?
30, yeah.
If I may say, we did cover that in our 7-page staff memo related to changes in net position and so forth. And if I may say, for the entire council, there's no new information here related to any policy choices that are necessary at this time related to directives that you've approved and authorized in your annual budget or any of the strategic direction related to these financials. This is a very careful accounting of that work, looking historically. So that's not a surprise or anything that was unexpected. If there's good news, it's that we have, I think, the most technically capable and hardest working accounting team that I've ever worked with since I've been a licensed CPA in 2006. This is just an excellent team of accountants who, as Ms. Jeffries pointed out, was very functional to work with and very accurate in their production of work papers to be audited. So I think that, and accompanied with our staff memo, provides some of those highlights, Counselor. Thank you.
Well then, just for my own understanding, on page 7, where it talks transfers at the very end, we took 22 million out of the governmental activities and shifted it over to the business activities?
Yes, I think that some of this relates to the American Reinvestment Plan Act. Again, that was authorized in your various budgets to transfer grant funds into our utilities as directed by the City Council.
Right, 7.5 in ARPA funds, which were taken from ARPA and put into the utility.
And then also some general funds were authorized by the City Council as well.
Was that 5 million?
I don't remember I think it was 7.5 and 7.5, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay. And do you know
And
what-
we could provide to the council a detailed schedule of the transfers at some point in the future if that's interesting.
Okay, and then the next thing is on page 17. I want to understand, again, under net position, okay, net investment in capital assets, that would be buildings and sewer pipes and sewer plants and all that. So that'd be that first line. And then restricted for emergencies is probably our rate stabilization fund and things like that, or what?
Yes, well, restricted for emergencies is the requirement under the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, Article
that's the
10,
Tabor.
Section 20, yes. And then for capital projects, that would be, those are examples whereby the city council's authorized construction contracts that are still in process, but the commitment has been made to work on and complete the process. Community development, improvements in open space and conservation, I think a lot of those are similar. Reserve for debt service, we have borrowings that are for restricted use and so forth. I think pensions probably fairly obvious, and then unrestricted would relate to those fund balances greater than those that are for revenue stabilization or general reserve.
Okay, and that is cash in the bank?
It's cash
Well,
and
in
marketable securities.
Bonds and
Yeah.
because on page 41,
Page 41.
okay, this seems to be the listing of the unrestricteds. So these look like, all to me, to be very marketable funds, or you could call them cash.
Yeah, the city's charter and Colorado statute would regulate eligible investments of all of the city's funds under, also one of my hats is serving as the city treasurer. And so yes, those are highly regulated, and of course, Ms. Jeffrey's firm has audited those for compliance with statute and charter and
Valuation.
verified the presence of the holdings and all of those things.
Okay, so that means in really essence, we as a city have over $300 million in liquid assets.
That's what's stated on page 41 in fair value. Yeah, that's,
Okay.
now that's assignable, of course, to all of the various different business and governmental activities.
Right,
in the
right,
city.
right. It's
Yes,
a combined value, but that is the liquid assets we have.
correct.
Okay, and then this is where that $4 million loss in the business activities came from, because it's a market valuation, not that we've sold those, not that we sold the securities, because we intend on keeping them into maturity, and then we won't lose anything. We will not lose that $4 million, but as of December 31st, we had to mark the fair value of them.
Yeah, we have to do that every year.
Yeah,
as
because
we
that's under
described that.
GASB, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and we explained that on page 78, footnote U, which was in a recent email from me to the city council on that subject.
Okay. Well, really, those are the observations I had.
Councilman Miller, that's it?
I don't remember anymore.
Anyone else?
Great job, thanks.
Yes, great job, thank you so much.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
being here.
Thank you, Ms.
Sorry you went
Jeffries.
so
Thank you.
late.
Oh, it's okay. I was productive.
It's 9:59, and if you don't have anything else, this meeting's adjourned.